morning to those joining us from the United States. Sorry for beginning a little late. I think we had some technical issues in trying to connect with everyone, but we are here all on board. On behalf of the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives, where I'm a trustee, and in very close association with the Rashtriya Raksha University, where I'm an emeritus resource faculty, and our partners and collaboration for this program, the Chennai Center for Chinese Studies, the International Institute for Contemporary Studies, Bangalore, and the Press Institute of India. We are welcoming you to another of our flagship programs that the Strategic Studies Forum, which is based out of these, composed out of these four organizations, have organized for the rest of the year. We had our first session last month on rare earth elements and Chinese manipulations in that area. Very well received. I think it was a very, very good program. This is the second in our series, which I think is a very timely one in many ways. Of course, we are quite aware of PRC's expansionism in Tibet, in eastern Turkestan and southern Mongolia. It has never relented from being repressive and going forward in a very, very aggressive way. So that's a predictable thing that the Chinese have been doing over the years. What is different this time is probably the timing. They came in brazenly into Eastern Ladakh in 2020. Just before that, they were beginning to nibble in the South China Seas a little more stridently and more aggressively and more assertively, entirely in the South China Seas, East China Seas, and then slowly moving their targets deeper into the Indian Ocean. Having said that, I would also mention that with the Afghanistan crisis, I think a new set of challenges opened up, where I think today with our stellar panelists here, I think distinguished set of people who are not only practitioners, they're with deep knowledge, great insights, but have skin in the game, as I might say, because they are actually directly affected with the kind of policies the Chinese have been aggressively pursuing over the past few years. I think it would be important for us to see whether this whole drive of the China dream, which Xi Jinping is going to go on, or are we going to be, as a community in the world, actually going to push back and make sure that the Chinese do not continue on this path of ravaging civilization, ravaging whether it is culture, it's art, it's traditions, religious traditions, it's a naked aggression on antagonizing or annexing territory. For this, I think we have a wonderful panel, and may I welcome Ambassador Kawal Sibal, who needs no introduction. It's very kind of him to have accepted our invitation, even though he's away from India. To preside and chair this conference. We are also welcoming all the people who have joined us and they're experts in the field in the areas that we have chosen to speak about today. Over to you, Ambassador Sibal. Please favor us with your keynote address. And after that, I would request Professor Shrikant Kondapalli, who also is a fellow trustee of the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives, which is actually focusing a lot on Tibet and the Himalayan belt. And of course, the other organization that I mentioned to you who are co-hosting it are looking at it not only from a China prism, but we're also looking at from a prism of international security, regional security, and most importantly, what the implications of whatever China is doing in this area to internal security of India. So for those few words, let me hand over the proceedings to Shrikant to take it forward, but immediately to Ambassador Sibal for his keynote address. Over to you, sir. Thank you. So we are not able to hear you, sir.
I had unmuted myself, but it went off. I don't know. And now can you hear me now?
Yes, you're audible. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
But you may have to put your camera on, sir.
Yeah, it just goes off. I started the video.
Okay, no problem.
I don't know why it keeps going off. I hope it doesn't happen again. Well, I began by saying that I thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts on the subject of today's webinar, Chinese expansionism in Tibet, Xinjiang, and in southern Mongolia. Chinese expansionism is now a reality on the ground, which the international community has been noting and trying to forge some kind of a strategy to deal with it, so far rather unsuccessfully. China, not only in the three areas that have been mentioned in the subject matter of today's webinar, but China's expansionism has been far more provocative in the maritime space, in the Western Pacific, in the South China Sea and the East China Sea in particular, because unlike in the case of the three territories that have been mentioned, which are physically part of China, and I don't think any country has taken a position that these are not territories which don't belong to China. But insofar as the South China Sea is concerned and the East China Sea is concerned, those are at worst or at best disputed areas, and at worst it is China's determination to grab as much territory as it can in this vital space, which is deeply connected with its plans for naval expansion, which are unprecedented in historical or modern times in terms of the number of naval assets that they are creating. On land, Chinese expansionism is very much a challenge for India. This is not a new story; it's an old story, because they make large claims on our territory, both in the north and in the east. And as was mentioned by Krishnan, we are currently facing a challenge of Chinese expansionism in eastern Ladakh. Our Prime Minister Modi, has been obliquely referring to this Chinese expansionism in various statements that he makes, without, of course, adding the adjective Chinese, but he talks about expansionism in general, but we know what the sense is. In the case of Bhutan, we find that China is again occupying territory and making claims, even though Bhutan is one of the tiniest countries in the world, and China is the fourth or the fifth largest country in the world, and still it has this territorial hunger. In Nepal also, in the northern part, they seem to have occupied physically some contested areas. And this entire program of building villages along the border areas is part of this expansionism, because nobody is actually intending to grab or encroach or physically occupy these disputed territories. And yet China is behaving as if there is a genuine physical threat of other countries, India or Bhutan for that matter, or Nepal, occupying what they consider is Chinese territory, and therefore they have to mobilize the local populations, and bringing in also the Han people to the border, mobilize the shepherds and the grazing and cattle grazers and all that to establish their physical presence close to the border as part of a general security barrier to aggression by foreign countries. Now, insofar as expansionism within China is concerned, whether in Tibet or in East Turkestan or in southern Mongolia, that is a slightly different issue, because the world is now not challenging China's sovereignty over these areas. Even Dalai Lama is not challenging Chinese sovereignty. He accepts that, subject to, of course, Tibet being given full autonomy in every sense. This whole thing about one China policy, which was part of the agreement between the United States and China when they first opened up their relations, has now become an established kind of narrative by the Chinese, as if there is something in international law which compels everybody and obliges everybody to accept the one China policy. And in this, of course, they're including Taiwan also, although they have not exercised sovereignty, or at least the Chinese Communist Party hasn't exercised sovereignty over Taiwan for I don't know, a century and a half or more, maybe more. So therefore we have to grapple with this fact that the Chinese expansionism in this area has to be defined somewhat differently. First of all, it is a military expansionism. There is no external threat to these territories. They are internal threats, but there are no external threats to these territories. And the kind of military dispositions that they have made in these areas is not at all commensurate with any external threat. And even in terms of internal threat, it is not commensurate with any realistic internal threat or uprising. After all, they have tested the Tibetan resolve. Tibetans haven't Tibetan responses. Tibetans have not resorted to terrorism. The worst they have done, or the best they have done, is to self-immolate themselves in protest against Chinese policies. And the Dalai Lama is wedded to non-violence. He has, in fact, China is lucky, unlike in the case of Xinjiang, where there is a local movement and an insurgency. In Tibet, there is no insurgency, and yet if you look at the militarization of Tibet, it is phenomenal. Even in the case of East Turkestan, there is this issue of the ETIM, but to what extent the concerns of China are highly exaggerated. And in fact, very insidiously, China is using this threat of terrorism to pursue this larger policy it has of sinicizing all these areas. And that is another form of expansionism, that you destroy their cultural identity, or you weaken it progressively, leading eventually to an effacement of a distinctive cultural identity, also a religious identity, very much in the case of Tibet and East Turkestan, and then even a demographic identity by a lot of Hans being relocated in both in Tibet and in East Turkestan, especially as part of this larger economic design they have of Xinjiang, of East Turkestan becoming a hub of energy flows from into China from Central Asia, plus as a bridgehead for economic expansion of China into Eurasia, infrastructure, railroads, and everything else that we see that they are building. Plus, of course, the CPEC, which connects the East Turkestan to Gwadar and to the Arabian Sea, which will give the Chinese what the British had for long years tried to prevent the British from having direct access to the Indian Ocean. but the Pakistani are facilitating this for China, and this fits in geopolitically with their other with their expansion in the GCC country, in the Gulf, as well as in the eastern seaboard of the Indian Ocean. So this expansionism has
You're muted.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, fine now, sir.
I'm sorry, some telephone came. I don't know. This is nonsensical, but how to prevent it? There is, of course, this is part of the economic expansionism, if you like. So there are these various aspects of this expansionism, which is economic, military, cultural, demographic, ethnic, religious, but also with a very pronounced colonial aspect to it, where the whole aim is resource extraction, basically, and lack of concern for the environment, especially in Tibet, the kind of projects that they have, which will destroy progressively the very sensitive ecology of this region. The dams that they intend to build, and especially one on the southern bend of the Brahmaputra, which will be the biggest project of its kind in the world. And if it comes to fruition, would actually be very dangerous for the biodiversity and the ecology of the Himalayan region, with the implications for India. Now, how can the world, and how should the world deal with this? Unfortunately, the world has not found the right answer, because the world, if you like, led by the United States and its allies, have consciously tied their hands in a way that they cannot now disentangle themselves from China so easily, because of a mistaken notion that the more they engage with China, the more they build up China's economic power, make it the manufacturing hub of the world. This will be profitable for everyone, for China, for the West, and it'll progressively democratize China by building up a middle class, and all that nonsense that we've been hearing about for years. Now, that false project, which was very cynical, because those who were behind this knew they were dealing with the Communist Party of China. It's not as if they didn't have experience of communist parties. After all, the Soviet Union was also a very communist state, and yet they didn't forgive the Soviet Union for its communist ideology. But they wanted to forgive China for its communist ideology, because they saw huge economic benefits from dealing with it, and therefore they had created this myth that it will become more and more democratic as time goes on, and it was an indirect justification for dealing with a communist totalitarian kind of a state. Now the reality is more and more staring in the face of everyone, and Chinese leadership has become very bold and aggressive and assertive in every way, not only economically, but also militarily, and in terms of ideology, where now the Chinese feel that their model is far more suited to especially the developing countries, but to the world in general, because the democracies have proved themselves to be ineffective, and they are on decline. The USA is on decline. This is their moment, and therefore they must capitalize on it as much as they can, and that explains also their aggressive postures in various areas. Now, because of the deep interlinkages that have been developed economically between the United States and Europe and Japan and others, including Taiwan, while there is talk about decoupling, this decoupling is not going to happen so easily, because this will cost the Western world hugely, especially at this time when they need access to markets because of COVID and everything else. I don't think there is inherent contradiction there, and I don't think that they will be able to easily decouple, except in some select areas. But even that will take time. It's not as if it can happen overnight. Already, as I read recently, the Wall Street guys are telling the U.S. government that they must remove all the tariffs that were imposed by Trump and open up the economic ties with China as they were before. So there are powerful forces. In Europe, they have signed they went ahead, led by Germany, to sign the comprehensive agreement on investment. That has been blocked because the Chinese have foolishly, as part of their arrogance, sanctioned key officials even of the EU Parliament. And therefore, the EU Parliament is not now going to ratify this. But nevertheless, if you understand the psychology and the economic momentum behind this, then you will understand that Europe also doesn't want to de-link itself with China. Now, this formula of that we will cooperate and we will compete and we will confront China is a very convenient one, because nobody is saying that between this cooperation and competition and confrontation, what will be the weightage given to each of these elements in this formula. So countries can decide that they can cooperate more and confront less. Others can say we can compete more and confront more and cooperate less. So there's no consensus on this, and this is a kind of escape clause that they've left themselves, because they can define what should be the degree of cooperation. And there are differences between Europe and the United States. After Afghanistan, setback to the United States, these differences are coming out more and more in the open, and now there's even more talk in Europe about strategic autonomy, because they feel that the United States cannot be relied upon and cannot be fully trusted, so they don't want to put their eggs in the US basket, despite the initial efforts by President Biden to reach out to the Europeans and forge a common front, including against China. Now, with Afghanistan, and I just spend a few more minutes on this. With Afghanistan's setback to the United States, virtually the United States will be left with no foothold on the landmass of Asia. And the biggest beneficiary of this will be China, not so much Russia, because China is already dominating the SCO, dominating Central Asia, because they have the economic power. And the entire Eurasian project and the Asia domination project will be facilitated by this. They have, as you know, already established a very strong foothold in Iran. In Pakistan, we know. Central Asia, we know. And now with Afghanistan also within their fold, there's this huge swath of territory on the Asian landmass they will control. And this will facilitate, if not immediately, but potentially their BRI project. They have secured their flank vis-a-vis Russia. Russia is now quite willing to play the junior partner with them, and their overall relationship has become much, much stronger. Finally, India's choices. I think our choices are limited. The few things that we must do, which we can do, but which may not produce dramatic results, but nevertheless, it's a strategy that is absolutely necessary. One is, of course, to stand up to China on the border, wherever they provoke us, and as we are doing already in the eastern Ladakh. We have to face China's challenges in our neighboring countries. They have already been able to entice them through their investment strategies and playing upon their insecurities vis-a-vis a large India. But we have no choice but to counter this as best as we can. We must keep reaching out to Iran, irrespective of US concerns, because now we have China concerns. especially after Afghanistan. And China and Iran have signed this 20-year, $20 billion, $25 billion agreement. Iran would like to keep its options open. They're not going to become subservient to China. So there's an opportunity for us there to be able to balance this out. We must keep a foothold in the SCO in order to make sure that that the triangular equation, Russia, China, and India, does not actually begin to work more and more in our disfavor if we are not present in this organization, which also compels us, and rightly so, to keep our relationship with Russia in the best shape possible. We must strengthen our relations with the GCC countries, which I know are becoming more and more concerned about China's relationship with Iran. And in that perspective, they are becoming more open to greater, stronger military security ties with India, and we must explore that. We must try and see how we can broaden our ties with Taiwan. Our greater openness towards Dalai Lama is something that we should pursue. This sends a signal to China. We must strengthen our naval power. In that perspective, the Quad and the Indo-Pacific are strategies that are important for us. And this would include more attention to Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore. And finally, we must do something about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and strengthen those islands as part of a platform for putting constraints on China's naval power in the future. These are some of the random thoughts I had. I thought I would share them with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Can I hand it over to Professor Kondapalli to please take it from here?
Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Verma. And greetings to you all. I was asked to anchor this important meeting. There are several distinguished speakers here. In terms of the ethnic policy, I would like to raise a few issues so that we are on the discussing these issues in more concerted manner. One, of course, is we have seen expansion, Chinese state, party state expansion in the, not just in the, what they call ethnic minority regions, national minority regions, but also in the peripheries, as Ambassador Conversible mentions about the peripheries, neighboring countries where we have seen the expansion of China in the recent times. They call it good neighborliness policy, but visualized from the other countries' perspective, there is expansion. So from the point of view of this element, previously they attempted the Western Development Campaign, and now, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. This has reduced the space between Han-dominated eastern coastal regions to that of the western regions, where much of the minorities, ethnic groups are located, which is part of our subject matter today. But in terms of policy, there is a specific Sinicization that has happened, and this is trying to evoke two policies. Initially, integration of the minority regions, but increasingly assimilation that has happened. So the Sinicization we have seen in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and is also happening in the Inner Mongolian region. So from that point of view, there is a increasing trust of the party state in these areas. Since, of course, late 2000s, when the Western Development Campaign and the Belt and Road Initiative touched upon these western regions in China. So the other thing that has happened within China is there is an increasing revision in the Stalin's idea of ethnic minorities or national minorities. They have defined, the Soviet Union defined the national minorities in what we now know about Stalin's definition. But increasingly, scholars like Marum from Beijing University or others, they have been suggesting that the Soviet definition on the national minorities is passé, and China needs to look at a new definition. And this new definition is to remove the regional autonomy that has been promised under the Common Program of 1949 and the 4 constitutions that China had in terms of these, say, Tibet Autonomous Region, Xinjiang Autonomous Region, Inner Mongolian Autonomous Region. So all that autonomy has to be abolished according to this new revival or revision in the ethnic minority policy. And that's where the expansion aspect comes in more concerted manner. The second is, of course, during Xi Jinping's time, we are witnessing what they mention as socialism with Chinese characteristics under the new era. That new era is reflective of the Han nationalism as well as the ideological transformation that is happening more intensely in the recent. So what is the impact of these? Across all the 3 regions that we are discussing today, number one is in the education system. In Tibet, in Xinjiang, and in Inner Mongolia, the Putonghua that has been imposed on the primary schools, secondary schools, so on and so forth, way back some years ago in Tibet, in Xinjiang, or now currently that has become controversial in Mongolia because the Mongolian people have taken up this issue in a more agitated manner. So education system is one that has come under stress with the Chinese policies. Number 2 is finances. With the 13th and 14th 5-year plans, China had initiated a substantial number of infrastructure projects and also, of course, assimilation policies, physical assimilation of these regions into China's fold. So in terms of finance, we see 80 to 90% of the projects are subsidized by central government, Beijing government. And so this is one area where one needs to look at more carefully. And I would request the speakers also to mention about the finances. Especially 14th 5-year plan has substantial allocations on this. So that is. A third area is in terms of culture. The previous speakers have mentioned about the Dalai Lama's autonomy and other Strasbourg proposals that were mentioned before. So in terms of culture and religion, the 4th element in our discussion, these have come under stress, substantial stress. And so there is a problem in terms of understanding these expansionist policies of China. So resource exploitation has been mentioned, especially in terms of coal, gas, oil, or other mineral resources, but also substantially as a result of this, as has been touched upon in the discussion so far, is on climate and ecosystems, which is again becoming problematic in many of these ethnic regions. So with this brief suggestion to elicit comments on the, may I now request the Excellency Sekyong, Mr. Pempa Sering, to outline his viewpoints on Tibet. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Shrikant Pali. We haven't met for a long time. I'm very happy to share this platform with so many galaxy of speakers here on this platform. I'm very happy to meet some of my old friends in Colombia, and there's also a great pleasure to share from the Sibo. And thank you, Ron and Tandon and Christian Walmaji for organizing this. The title here, PRC'S Expansionist Moves in Tibet, Southern Mongolia, and Eastern Turkestan. In terms of territory, I think it would be more appropriate to say PRC's expansionist moves beyond Tibet, Southern Mongolia, and East Turkestan. Right now, I am in Ladakh, so which is again one of the hotspots here, and I think it's appropriate that I'm participating in this from Ladakh and trying to get a better understanding of the situation here, not just the Tibetan communities here, but also some other issues that concerns Tibet and India. In terms of PRC's territorial expansion is moved beyond Tibet, as a Southern and Uyghur. But the only reason I've been putting this idea over and over in my head as to why China is doing this, I see an element of insecurity in the form of the survival of the Communist Party in China, in terms of the amount of money they spend on internal security, then external security. I think, therefore, I think, as Abhishek put it very rightly, expecting a lot from China by involving them in the global community of nations and expect them to be more responsible. In the last 20, 30 years, we realized that now this is not the right thing that is happening with China. So we do see a lot of changes in the attitude of other nations towards China, which is, I think, very timely. There are no new formations of alliances against China's expansionist moves. And we ourselves, as Tibetans, will take this opportunity to reach out to other nations. And one thing that other nations can definitely do is to revise their one China policy. And I think Kapilji, Master Kapilji, put this saying that His Holiness has not challenged the sovereignty of Tibet. In our case, we have not accepted China's sovereignty of Tibet, even though we have proposed the middle way as a way forward in resolving the Tibetan issue. We have the immediate urgency of the of PRC's expansionist moves in Tibet, on the issues that Srikant Pandapalli raised just now, on the 4 or 5 issues we raised. And these are of immediate concern to our people, not just in Tibet. As I understand, the population transfer in Southern Mongolia has reached a tipping point. Some years ago, I was told by one of my friends from Southern Mongolia that the population of Mongolians in Southern Mongolia is only 16%. And the population of Chinese and Turks in the region is about 84%. So the population transfer policy and assimilation and integration of the movement of more un-Chinese people into national minority regions is astounding, and the same is happening in Uyghur and also in Tibet. In Tibet, we realize even though it's very difficult to get a very, very exact number based on the 2020 census, we can say for sure that the Chinese population has already become more in Tibet, even though we are not against multiculturalism, but at least from the point of view of our majority community, completely overwhelming a minority community is not acceptable. And this amounts to a certain level of cultural genocide, just like what's happening in Uyghur and also in Mongolia. And then other issues like language. Just before I left Ladakh, that was a few days before, when they celebrated 100 years of communism in Lhasa. At the beginning of the presentation by the Chinese leaders there, they stressed on the importance of promotion of the local languages. But at the end of their presentation, then it comes to the promotion of Chinese language, which I think Srikant Pandapalli put it very rightly. So language has become a major issue Tibetans who study Tibetan, it's not possible for them to get jobs if you study Tibetan alone, or if you have a rudimentary command of the Chinese language, is not enough to get a job in Tibet. So that puts not just in Tibet, but also in Mongolia and southern Mongolia and Hindu also in the same place where the original language does not get any prominence. And talking about the common language, that Chinese language, which will be pervading in all of China, including Tibet and other regions. So, an environment definitely is a major problem. Of course, there seemingly the Chinese government is giving a little more importance, but there is a very narrow-minded approach to the protection environment without any consideration to the other neighboring countries, including water-sharing, the hydro information sharing system with Muslim countries. This will have a major implication in all the neighboring countries, downstream neighboring countries, and the issue of culture in terms of religion also it's a huge issue where the number of monks and nuns have been reduced. The development in terms of physical structure of the monasteries is only a facade to show that there is religious freedom, but in actuality, there is no religious freedom. As far as I get to hear, in the last few days, there have been a lot of pressure from the Chinese government. They have been going door to door to the families where they know that some of the relatives are in foreign countries and they're getting contact numbers and all that. And we also know for a fact that embassies and consulates in different parts of the world are reaching out to Tibetans in the diaspora community, threatening them with dire consequences. So all these are happening, and I think I won't take too much time because there are too many speakers here. But these are major concerns, and from the Tibetan side, we are going to study the reality of the situation inside Tibet and come out with well-documented papers to tell the world as to what is exactly happening inside Tibet, and also communicate to the Chinese leaders that what they are doing in Tibet and Uyghur or Southern Mongolia is not really good for the people of these nationalities as well as to the Chinese government. I get this feeling that the world community is waking up to the reality and they'll stand up, and at the least what they can do is change the one China policy so that China can. They have been espousing over the last so many decades is not necessarily accepted by the world community, and the world community has to accept the historical reality of all these regions. And then only I think China will wake up to a level of understanding that they have to consider the welfare of the Tibetan people, the welfare of the Uyghur people, and the welfare of the Southern Mongolia people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that exposition on the Chinese expansionist policies in Tibet and what needs to be done in very crisp and succinct manner. I was asked to briefly mention what the impact of Tibet on Indian security. So I will just enlist a few points here so that we have enough time for discussion on these issues. From an Indian perspective, the integration physically of Tibet into China, that has resulted in the Han migration into Tibet. And secondly, there is also the militarization of the Tibet region. Thirdly, there is a lot of finance that has come from Guangdong and Shenzhen. The banks here have been financing most of the projects, which also means that we have seen the Chinese financiers are increasingly going into Tibet for these infrastructure projects and others. Specifically, the 14th five-year plan laid down some $29 billion investment in Tibet, and this is obviously in terms of roads. They have something like 120,000 kilometers of roads right now, and high-speed railway is also being expanded into Tibet, and the fiber optics, energy pipelines, the other infrastructure projects. These are the focus of China, which means that Chinese party state expansion into Tibet has been quite substantial. It's only recently that at Medok, the last county, has been connected by road, and so this suggests that the expansion of the infrastructure has brought the party state much closer into the Indian border areas. So this is a substantial phenomena that has happened. Second is Chinese are recruiting a lot of Tibetans into the infrastructure projects or in the military, paramilitary forces. So this is another phenomena which is of concern for India in the longer run. And thirdly, in terms of the environmental issues, there is the glacier meltdown of nearly 23 cubic meters receding per annum, which has substantial environmental impact on the downstream, especially in the South Asian region. This has led to, of course, the river water issues as a major area of concern, especially in terms of the deforestation and biodiversity and wildlife. Also, in Nagari prefecture and other areas, the Chinese have been mobilizing the Tibetans into ghettos. So there is a removal of the population, Tibetan population, from those areas, and this has led to the demographic changes, especially as China is putting up 628 Shaokang villages, well-off society villages. This would mean that the party state would be straight on the line of actual control in the near future, which means that we are going to possibly militarize the line of actual control areas in the near future. Both India and China are looking at this option, China more concertedly, and as a result, of course, India is responding to that. The military integration of Tibet into China is not just about Tibet, but also in terms of China's outreach into South Asia, Central Asia, and West Asia in the near future. So that is one where we have substantial concerns on the nature of the Chinese state expansion in this context. The 7th Tibet Forum meeting in last year, August 29th, resulted in the further Sinicization of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, into the Chinese fold. And of course, the issue of the succession to the 15th Dalai Lama, that issue also puts up the Trans-Himalayan belt into trouble, which also means that it would have implications for India in the Trans-Himalayan, especially in terms of law and order and other areas. As you all know, the TPSA has been passed, Tibet Policy Support Act, by the US President in January this year. So that brings in the focus onto the succession issue on the 15th Dalai Lama related matters. So broadly, to summarize, the Chinese expansionist policies in Tibet have implications both at traditional as well as at non-traditional security challenges for India. So the way forward, obviously, is India is now debating this issue in a more concerted manner. You may have noticed that the Prime Minister Modi had departed from his policy previously and greeted the Dalai Lama on his birthday. And of course, there are other changes that are being initiated, including the strategic roads construction as well as the repopulation of the line of actual control areas. So in the light of the situation on the border, especially in Ladakh, Aksai Chin regions, there is a militarization that has happened, but not just confined to this area, but across the line of actual control. We have mobilized some 50,000 additional troops across the line of actual control, which means that it is likely to intensify in the near future. So let me stop here and go to the next distinguished speaker in requesting him to explain to us, Mr. Togocho, the brief history, Chinese interests in southern Mongolia, current policies and implications for the future. Over to you, sir.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you, the FNVA team and other organizations for organizing this panel and extending the invitation to me. Before I discuss the current human rights conditions and China's main interest in Southern Mongolia, I think it's necessary for me to touch upon the historical background of Southern Mongolia. Southern Mongolia is widely known as Inner Mongolia as a result of the direct translation of Chinese terminology called Nei Mongo, which is a highly Sinocentric terminology that conveys the message of China's territorial claim over this part of Mongolia. Actually, in my language, in Mongolian, we call ourselves as Ur-Mongol, which is a simple geographical terminology, meaning southern part of Mongolia or southern Mongolia. However, the Chinese translation name Mongo has deliberately distorted the simple geographical terminology into a political propaganda, claiming that this part of Mongolia is China's Inner Mongolia or Interior Mongolia. From a territorial perspective, Southern Mongolia has a vast territory of nearly 2 million square kilometers, covering the so-called the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region and Mongolian inhabited areas in the neighboring Chinese provinces and other historical Mongolian territories elsewhere within the borders of the People's Republic of China. From the demographic perspective, the Mongolian population of Southern Mongolia is about 6 million, which is twice as large as that of the independent country of Mongolia, or we normally call Northern Mongolia. Southern Mongolia had always been an integral part of the Greater Mongolia and maintained its own government, diplomacy, military, and currency up until 1949, as the Chinese Communist regime took control over China and established the People's Republic of China in 1949. Southern Mongolia was forcibly annexed to China and became the first so-called nationality minority autonomous region of China. Since then, the darkest chapter of Mongolian history started. As the testing ground of China's all forms of ethnic policy, Southern Mongolia has experienced waves of genocide, ethnic cleansing, political purge, economic exploitation, cultural assimilation, and environmental destruction. For example, from the late 1960s through the early 1970s, the Chinese government carried out a massive genocide campaign in Southern Mongolia. At least 100,000 Mongolians were killed and 500,000 persecuted. At that time, the total Mongolian population of Southern Mongolia was about 1.5 million. That means 1/3 of the total population is affected by this genocide campaign. In the 1980s, the Chinese government has escalated this cultural assimilation and population transfer in Southern Mongolia. Millions of Chinese peasants poured into Southern Mongolia, and pushed the indigenous Mongolian people out of their ancestral land. Starting early 2000, the Chinese government has implemented a series of new policies under which Mongolian traditional nomadic way of life was blamed for environmental degradation, which in fact was caused by the Chinese large-scale farming and agricultural practice. In the name of recovering grassland ecosystem, the Chinese government implemented the discriminatory and hostile policies toward Mongolian nomadic of life. These include the so-called ecological migration and the total ban over livestock grazing, with which the government of China forcibly displaced the entire Mongolian herders population from their ancestral lands to predominantly Chinese populated urban and agricultural areas. In the past 2 decades, the grazing livestock on grassland has been considered as a crime, and the herders who graze their livestock on their own land have been subject to heavy fines, livestock confiscation, arrest, detention, and even imprisonment. In fact, the government of China has never been shy about publicly advocating the eradication of the Mongolian traditional way of life. For example, in 2015, the Chinese central government State Council website publicly announced that by end of 2015, China would resettle all remaining 1.2 million nomads within its borders. This means China has officially wiped out the millennia-old nomadic civilization 6 years ago within its territories. After the 7 decades of physical genocide, deprivation of all kinds of rights, erasure of distinct way of life, and total destruction of a natural environment, now the Chinese are targeting our last defense of national identity, which is our language. A wholesale cultural genocide has been launched by the Chinese authorities in southern Mongolia after crashing last year's large-scale non-violent resistance movement. The official euphemism of this new round of cultural genocide is bilingual education, or more precisely, the second generation bilingual education policy, which in fact is a carefully planned campaign to wipe out the Mongolian language, culture, and identity once and for all, and turn Southern Mongolia into a homogeneous Chinese society that is worried from any form of future ethnic problem. Sensing this genocidal nature of the campaign, last September, the entire Southern Mongolian population has stood up and carried out a region-wide civil disobedience resistance movement. Tens of thousands of students took to the street, and millions of Mongolian parents, teachers, and ordinary herders, government officials, party members, and even police officers took part in the resistance movement. Estimated 300,000 students joined this school boycott. According to some analysts, this protest was the largest mass movement in mainland China since the 1989 student movement. Of course, the Chinese governments responded with a mass arrest, arbitrary detention. We estimate around 10,000 Southern Mongolians have been arrested, detained, and placed under house arrest. Many of them are still under extrajudicial detention without any legal due process. In addition to this, other methods of intimidation include firing people from jobs, removing officials from positions, expelling and blacklisting students, suspending herders' social benefit, denying access to bank loans, and even confiscation of properties for their refusal to cooperate with the authorities. At least 11 Southern Mongolians took their lives in protest of this new round of cultural genocide. Also, as part of the campaign effort to completely sinicize the Mongolian population, Chinese authorities are carrying out a region-wide intensive training program called the Training for the Firm Inculcation of Chinese Nationality Common Identity. It's in Chinese called 中华民族共同体意识. It's a huge campaign now, sweeping across Southern Mongolia, under the slogan of "Speak Chinese and become a civilized person." The entire Mongolian population, including students, teachers, party members, government officials, and ordinary herders, are subjected to this training to discard their so-called narrow nationalistic identity and become a civilized person, or a Chinese, simply. This is what's happening in Southern Mongolia now. All of these are part of China's new ethnic policy that Professor Kandapalli mentioned earlier. It's officially called second generation ethnic policy, proposed by Professor Marong and other official scholars, and implemented by Xi Jinping, abandoning Stalin's nationality definition and claiming to mimic the United States melting pot model. So why China is so desperately trying to wipe out the Mongolian population and turn Southern Mongolia into a worry-free zone? And what's China's main interest in Southern Mongolia? First, I think it's China's national security interest in Southern Mongolia. Southern Mongolia has always been called the Chinese motherland's northern frontiers, due to its strategic location between China and Russia, and most importantly, the independent country of Mongolia. We are north to us is the independent country of Mongolia. So during the Soviet era, Southern Mongolia was considered China's front line with the revisionist countries of Soviet Union and Mongolian People's Republic. Today, China is still worried about Southern Mongolia's possible merger with the independent country of Mongolia, which not only isn't always considered by the Southern Mongolia as their motherland, but also it is a democratic country. So secondly, Southern Mongolia is China's energy warehouse. In 2009, China announced that Southern Mongolia became China's energy base. Southern Mongolia produced world's 95% of rare earth. Southern Mongolia became China's largest coal producer for almost 2 decades. And China's largest natural gas reserve is found in Southern Mongolia. And today, Southern Mongolia provides entire China's 1/3 of natural gas. Graphite is another critical ingredient for high-tech products. Southern Mongolia became China's top graphite producer. Recently, China also announced that China's largest world-grade uranium deposit is found in Southern Mongolia. That, according to Chinese Mining Association, that can enable China to make 3 million atomic bombs. So lastly, the Southern Mongolia has always been the most favorite destination for Chinese colonial settlers due to its geographical proximity to Beijing and Chinese historical heartland. Waves of colonial settlers poured into Southern Mongolia, especially since 1949, under various names, including the so-called Development and Construction Corps, and also that there's called educated youth going to the countryside. And now the Chinese investors and Chinese miners are pouring into Southern Mongolia and destroying our ecosystem, polluting our environment, and extracting our natural resource, and kicking out the Mongolians who have kept the delicate balance between man and nature for thousands of years. So these are some of the main reasons why China is trying to erase Mongolian culture and obliterate Mongolian identity and turn our nation into a simple and plain Chinese province. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That's quite articulated presentation on how the Sinicization process has been underway. I'm tempted to ask a few questions. Kindly respond at the end of the discussions. One is there is this information related to deterioration of land area. Some 2% of the land area annually is being, becoming desertified. Secondly, there is the productivity of the region has decreased almost 30%. And of course, desertification is nearly 60% in the region, rising temperatures between 2 to 5 degrees centigrade is what the other. So my question is the uniting the three Mongolias, Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, and Mongolian Buryatskaya. What is the nature of this movement now? What are the prospects for this in terms of the protest movements and linking up with the what you mentioned as Northern Mongolia? Linking again to the Tibet issue, which is very crucial to understand the Mongolian aspect, is the Northern Mongolia came under heavy pressure from China when the Dalai Lama visited Ulaanbaatar in 2002 and 2016. Heavy pressure on Mongolia at that time. So what is the current status of this Tibet issue in Mongolia? Let me turn to the next distinguished speaker, to Venerable Rinpoche, to speak on the issues of Buddhism, Southern Mongolia in regional politics. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for bringing us people from different backgrounds and different areas to discuss this very important issue. As Mr. Varma had mentioned at the introduction speech, that it is a timely matter that we come together and discuss this particular issue. Just to briefly speak about myself, not to boast about who I am and what I am, but just to give you a idea of how we are all interconnected in some way. I am an ethnic Mongolian, but I am a Kalmyk Mongolian. Kalmyk is one of the ethnic groups that is part of Russia and has been part of the Russia for the last 400 years or so. My parents immigrated to America after the Second World War, as well as a large number of Kalmyk Mongols immigrated to the West. I was born in America, but at the age of 7, my family decided that they have too many kids, so they decided to send me off to India. So I grew up in India in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, I came to Russia, mainly in Kalmyk Republic, which is where my parents and grandparents are from, to help and revive, restore, and rebuild Buddhism in an area where Buddhism once freely flourished. So I kind of label myself as someone who is made in the USA, assembled in India, and marketed or distributed in Russia. So I'm very much familiar with the Tibet situation, the history of Tibet, where it stands today, because I grew up in a Tibetan community. And not only that, I'm currently serving as a representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration to Russia, Mongolia, and CIS countries. At the same time, growing up in India, I'm very much familiar with the Indian culture, mentality, and as well as its current policies to a certain extent. I'm not as a great, specialist as the other speakers, but nevertheless, to the certain extent, I'm more very much familiar with what's going on. Being based in Russia for the last 25 plus years, also I'm aware of the history of the Soviet Union, as it was once called, and also the changes that it went through and how the government is today. Nowadays, that when we talk about relationships, diplomatic relationships between countries, we are thinking that it is simply a relationship in terms of economy. But it is much more deeper than money or economy. If we look at the relationship between India, Tibet, the Trans-Himalayan Belt, Inner Mongolia, Mongolians that are nowadays part of Russia, our history shows that our relationship is deeply rooted, not in economy, not in trade, not in diplomacy or politics, but it is deeply rooted in spirituality. Way before trade agreements were signed, there was already students from these areas studying in India. Way before these nuclear pacts were signed, these spiritual and cultural relationships existed. So in a way, we are really mainly the participants of today's platform is really deeply rooted more on spirituality. So based on what's happening globally and Chinese policies implemented not only in Tibet, East Turkestan, and Southern Mongolia, but how they are shifting their power, how they're struggling to move their one China policy, how they are pushing towards the one belt, one road kind of policy around the world, we, the people who have been living under this such totalitarian system, have a responsibility to unite our voices. You know, as a Mongolian, I look back, I'm very sympathize with the issues of Southern Mongolians. At the same time, based on the history of Southern Mongolia and as well as Tibet and Mongolia itself, what has happened, the Chinese policies, I automatically sympathize with the people of East Turkestan. So therefore, it is very important for us to unite our struggle, not locally, not regionally, but also on a global level as well. Let me give you a simple example. It is a habit for governments, presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, and so on, when they are dealing with China, they always bring up the issue based on what the trend is. There has been many occasions, for example, the US government as well as the European governments dealing with China. When the topic of East Turkestan a few years ago, as we all know what happened in East Turkestan, there's no need for me to go into details. When that was a hot topic, and when they were dealing with China, they brought up East Turkestan, but they forgot the issue of Tibet, Southern Mongolia, as well as what was going on in Hong Kong. Now, when the Hong Kong became an issue, they were mentioning Hong Kong, human rights in Hong Kong, civil rights, freedom of speech, freedom of journalism, and so on. But at the same time, they were forgetting to mention Tibet, they were forgetting to mention East Turkestan, and they're forgetting to mention Southern Mongolia as well. So here we have to unite our voices and unite our efforts and to ensure that any government dealing with China never forgets our brothers and sisters who are still under the totalitarian system of the People's Republic of China. Nowadays in Russia, as we look at what's happening globally, now China and Russia has become very close friends. But this friendship is very superficial. It's not sincere. Russia does not trust China. but they are forced to make friends with China. Why? Because of oil and gas. Because of the global economic crisis, many of the Western countries, because of the global economic crisis, as well as what happened in Ukraine in 2014, many of the governments implied sanctions against Russia. They decreased their import from Russia, which is mainly oil and gas. Russia needs to sell that. When European countries are buying less, and you have the oil and gas just coming out of the ground nonstop, you cannot put a stop to that. You have to sell it. So what has Russia done? They decided to sell it to China. Not because of money, but because they needed hard cash. China needed the energy, and that was their advantage that they played to get it at a cheaper rate, below the rate of what they were selling to the West, and take advantage of that opportunity. And Russia, they got it with hard cash, and that's what's happening. So it is very important for us to really not only discuss and give recommendations or give random thoughts, but it is very important for us what actions that we can take collectively, what pressure that we can put as independent, as NGOs. Many of us are called NGOs, or as an NGO, how we can influence our governments, local governments, wherever we are from, to ensure that anytime the issue of East Turkestan is brought up, that the Hong Kong issue, as well as the Tibet issue, as well as the Southern Mongolia issue is not forgotten. When East Turkestan is brought up, that Tibet issue and Southern Mongolia and Hong Kongers are not forgotten. So I think if we are able to pressure our local governments and make that an issue, not only an issue of Tibet, not only an issue of East Turkestan or Southern Mongolia, because we are all the ones who are sharing the same problems, same issues, same difficulties, same struggles. Just as Mr. Tokchok has clearly, explained what is happening in Southern Mongolia. The same thing is happening in Tibet as well, and the same thing is happening in East Turkestan as well. Now, if we look at today's population, in terms of in Southern Mongolia, 79% Han Chinese versus 17% Mongolians. Now, if we look at the Uyghur East Turkestan population, now the statistic may not be up to date, but as of right now, the Uyghur is 45% versus 40% of Han Chinese. If that is a true number, I guarantee you, within the next 5 years or 10 years maximum, that the population of the Han Chinese in East Turkestan will be more than the Uyghurs. That's a threat. That's a danger, not only for us as people, but for our heritage, for our rich heritage that derived not only our culture, language, not only our spoken language, but this rich Indian heritage that came from India, which is called Buddhism. So India, no matter what, no matter how many touristic places and modern statues, contemporary statues, China is building with the aim to claim that China is the center of Buddhism. Historically, India is the place, and that can never be erased from the face of the world. Therefore, India has to stand up to mark its place as the birthplace of Buddhism, as the center of Buddhism. And along with that, every Mongolian every Tibetan, every individual from the Trans-Himalayan belt will definitely follow. Now, nowadays, Afghanistan is a very hot topic. What appalls me so much right now, the friendship that China and the Taliban has made, that is a threat to humanity. Along the way of all these discussions, I wonder if the Taliban had ever brought up the issues, the safeguard, the threat of their Muslim brothers and sisters of East Turkestan. I highly doubt that this issue was ever brought up. Why? Because of their interests of investments in Afghanistan, of China's interest to exploit the resources of Afghanistan. So therefore, I think it is very important for us not only to share random thoughts, but also it is a timely matter that we all unite our voices and talk and take action. We are the ones that are going to change governments, the policies. We are the one that are going to influence, whether they are MPs, parliament members, Congress members. We have to reach out to them and slowly climb the ladders. Of course, the Southern Mongolian representatives are doing a wonderful job, but they don't have a global voice. They don't have a global spokesperson. Of course, the East Turkestanis are doing a wonderful job in the West, being a voice for the voiceless. But unfortunately, as the Southern Mongolians, they are not reaching out as much as they should or can. Luckily for the Tibetan people, they had a wonderful leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the subject of His Holiness the Dalai Lama is a completely different platform that we should also be discussing. His Holiness is 86 years old now. How much time he remains with us is also questionable. And what will happen to the reincarnation is also a very big question and a very big concern. So it is a timely matter that we also come together and discuss that issue as well. Luckily for the Tibetan people, they had a wonderful world, globally admired persons such as His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Therefore, the Tibet issue never faded away. Therefore, the Tibet issue never got lost along the struggles of the Hong Kongers, Southern Mongolians, and the East Turkestan people. But unfortunately, the Southern Mongolians, as well as the East Turkestanis, need our support. The Tibetan people have a moral responsibility to support them as well. We as individuals have a moral responsibility to do what we can. We as NGOs, as institutions, as educational institutions, to do proper research, scientific research, the truth, not based on who gives more money and I'll do a favor in writing a more positive article for them or this government, but finding out, comparing both sides. Every story has two sides. So it is very important for us to compare and also at the same time to use our intellect to make the proper and moral judgment for all. So therefore, I would like to, since I'm running out of time, I want to thank all of you for listening and giving me the opportunity to be part of today's program. And I look forward to future discussions, not only discussions, but also future actions together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Venerable Rinpoche. I think you have put the whole issue in terms of the global action that is required in this struggle. Also, the connection between Hong Kong that has not been raised so far in our discussions, so I'm tempted to raise an issue here, which is that the only country which had explicitly supported Mongolian unity is Japan. In 1919, they had the Greater Mongolia concept. So is that also part of the global struggle that you are visualizing in terms of taking Japan into consideration? So that was what I was tempted to ask. The second one was the Russian response to issuing of a visa to the Dalai Lama. There is a lot of pressure on Russia by the Chinese to cancel the visa before. And of course, your organization had worked tirelessly for this, but what is the nature of this visit to Russia? So that is, let me shift towards East Turkestan Xinjiang portion. This is very important as well in terms of the situation that we are visualizing in the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. But in itself, at the domestic level itself, there is a lot of developments. One of the strange things that has happened in the last decade or so is the number of insurgency cases have come down, partly because of the counter-terrorism laws that China passed in 2007, 2014, 2015. Specific provisions here in counter-terrorism. Article 76, Chapter 7 has those. More important, there is the over more than 50% of the endangered state security are related to the Uyghurs. And this has resulted in a lot of concern for everyone. Then there is also the assimilationist policies that Chen Chuanko had implemented, not just in Tibet before, but also in Xinjiang, East Turkestan, in terms of surveillance and the 1 million incarceration, which has resulted in the US Congress as well as European Parliament passing those sanctions on the Chinese officials involved in this. So there is, again, there is another interesting turn. Mr. Baradar, who met with Wang Yi in Tianjin a few days ago, the Chinese insisted that Haji Furqan, the ETIM activists, be handed over to the Chinese. It appears that Baradar has not given any assurance in this regard. So could Mr. Hassan and Mr. Isa elaborate on this issue as well? The nature of the ETIM or TIM, Turkestan Islamic Movement, in relation to the situation in Afghanistan. Over to you, sir, Mr. Hassan, to outline the policies, and then Mr. Isa, followed by Mr. Hassan.
Thank you. Thank you for the very nice introduction and also your instigating questions. Also, thanks for the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives organizing this timely conference to highlight Uyghur, Tibetan, Southern Mongolian, and Hong Kong, the issue, urgent issue. And as the host, Mr. recommended, I prepared a little bit for the Chinese policy in East Turkestan, its timeline. I give a short outline. Actually, the China's policy towards East Turkestan is a typical expansionism, starting from the collapse of the Manchu Empire. And if we all recall the history, the Chinese nationalist slogan for overthrowing the Manchu Empire was kick out Dalu, which means Manchu, and reestablish Han China, which is Zhonghua, at the time in the Sun Zhongshan or Jiang Kaishi, other Chinese nationalists articles or their speech, they said that China is 12 proper province, which means excluded Tibet, Southern Mongolia, East Turkestan as well. It's not part of the China. That was the nationalist government's slogan. But after they got China's power, they tried, but couldn't handle it well because of the East Turkestan and Tibet, Southern Mongolians' resistance. But after 49, this is all changed. And we know in East Turkestan before the 49, we had a short part of independence, which is called East Turkestan Republic, supported by the Soviet Union. Started from the 1944, 12th of November, until the 49, the Chinese came. And from 1949 to 1966, I would say this is the first period of the Chinese expansionism to East Turkestan. It's a soft power appeasement policy. Because at the time, still, we have our national army, approximately around 50,000 armed personnel, with the Soviets' support, and Stalin as the designer of or supporter of the East Turkestan government, still alive. So China not dare to eliminate whole, but they tried. So it's after the so-called peace liberation of the East Turkestan, until the 62, the Soviet Sino broke up. The Chinese government isolated some nationalistic and awakened Uyghur intellectual elite and tried to appease and to buy out some of the Uyghur intellectual or elites. So in 62, first Uyghurs exodus, or I would say it's a refugee exodus, come out in 1962 around May. Started from Wulja, which was the East Turkestan Republic's temporary capital from 1944 to 1949. In that big exodus, Uyghurs elite intellectual run to the Soviet Union Central Asian Republic, and Chinese allowed them to leave, most of the Uyghur intellectual and the elites from the East Turkestan Republic. And this period is mostly the Chinese use the tactic of divide and conquer, because East Turkestan Republic was together, Uyghur together with Kazakh, Mongol, Shibe, which is Manjus, another one tribe, and other, all the non-Han people in East Turkestan. So they use the divide and conquer policy or strategy to separate the Uyghur from rest of them. And starting from 1966 to 1976 is, we all know, that was the Cultural Revolution in China called. In this period, the Chinese government used all the means in the terror control, started to eliminate some of the intellectual elites from the Uyghur society, and also re-engineering the Uyghur society, culturally, historically, geographically, everything. And it's a disaster for Uyghur. And also to the Uyghur society, starting from the Cultural Revolution, the trust with the society, its own society, and each people around, the trust was lost because of the Chinese terror in the Cultural Revolution. You are not trusting anyone, even your neighbor, your wife or husband, even your kid, because anyone can be a spy for the Chinese under that aggressive terror in the Cultural Revolution. Luckily, after the Mao Zedong's death, the China started a so-called reform. So the third period was starting from 1976 to 1989, the Tiananmen Massacre. A lot of people only know the Tiananmen Massacre, but most of the people didn't pay attention to the East Turkestan's democratic movement. It started from the 1985 in Xinjiang University. And also Dolkunisa, World Uyghur Congress President, Mr. Dolkunisa, he is one of the leaders of the students' movement. It is far earlier than the Tiananmen movement, democracy movement. In this period, the Chinese government, because of the after the Cultural Revolution, they are adjusting themselves, so they didn't know how to deal with it. So which in that time period, until 89, we were able to revitalize the culture, the beliefs, and their society. And also to learn their history again from the survived intellectuals. And just in the 1989, 19th of May, just 1 month before the Tiananmen Massacre, in Urumqi happened another one big demonstration in Uyghur society together with Hui Muslim. And it was cracked down violently. Arrested, killed a lot of Uyghur. Starting from that point, actually, the East Turkestan, earlier than the Tiananmen Massacre, it's the Chinese policy switched again. From the 1989 to 2009 is another one period, the fourth period of the Chinese policy. And in this period, the Chinese switched to a colonial policy, economic exploitation, marginalizing Uyghurs economically, politically, and started to make the demographic change. The Chinese government encouraged I call it political migration of the Chinese, giving them incentive in the political, economic, and any support, giving them free housing, giving them the free land, and giving them the very relaxed so-called Planned Parenthood. So they make a big switch in the demographic really. And also, they started to crack down on the Uyghurs culturally, in the religion, and also to the society. And within the 2009, we all know, in 5th of July, in Urumqi, happened a big demonstration of the Uyghur. This was actually, it was triggered by the government forced migrant worker of the Uyghur attacked by the Chinese in Shaoguan, Guangdong. And a few of Uyghur was beaten to death by the Chinese mob. And then the 5th of July, the Uyghur student went to the street, the demonstration, asking for the government to be involved and investigate the event, the killing of the Uyghur, give Uyghurs the justice. But the Chinese government, instead, they use the paramilitary and shoot the student and started a big crackdown. And in this fourth period, it has a small switch in between. That was in 2001, after 9/11. Before the 9/11, Chinese always accused Uyghur as a separatist, anti-revolutionary, counter-revolutionary, etc., but never mentioned anything about terrorism. But after 9/11, in 2001, the second week, the Chinese government started to claiming they were the victim of the terrorism. And then in 2002, in December, first time China officially published a white paper and claiming they are the victim of the East Turkestan Islamic movement. Before that, this organization never existed in any Chinese media official document. And even though this is a made-up organization, but international world, a lot of country accepted as it is. Accepted it as it is. I did research on this. I will publish a article a few days later. And even after the 2002, they claimed this East Turkestan Islamic movement, but still they couldn't unify the name. In different government document, in different article, in different conference, the Chinese government gave different name to this organization, and even its establishment date. And in one official document, it says it was East Turkestan Islamic movement was established in Pakistan in 1993. But in another one, it says 1997 it was established in East Turkestan, and also different people's name, which means obviously this was a fabricated organization. This is the fourth period. Of course, the last one is starting from the 2009, this 5th of July uprising from the Uyghur. It was a result of the marginalization of Uyghur, exploitation of the Uyghurs' land, and also culturally the destruction of the Uyghur culture. And Mr. Batu mentioned another one. After the 2009, in 2010, a few Chinese intellectuals, one is Marong from Beijing University, another one is, his name is Huang Gang from Tsinghua University, another one intellectual, his name is Hu Lianhe. He is still in the United Front. Main responsibility is so-called minority issue. These three intellectuals initiated a new minority policy, or they call it second generation of the minority policy. And its main goal, or its main content, was abolishing all the autonomous region, abolishing the nationality, and abolishing the national language, and unify it in so-called Goyu, which means the Chinese language, Putonghua. And in one of their articles, specifically Hu Lianhe made 2 points. One is East Turkestan issue, not quote unquote, just meaning. East Turkestan issue existed until the 2009. The reason is because Uyghur intellectuals, they made a bad example. They are still promoting the Uyghur nationalism ideology. So if China wants to solve East Turkestan problem, they should first get rid of this Uyghur intellectual or make them accept the Chinese ideology, make them to accept the 中华民族 concept. And his second suggestion is China is have enough money. Economically, we are strong enough. So move Uyghurs from Uyghur density southern East Turkestan to China's different province, spread them out, and move big Chinese population to East Turkestan, make them minority in East Turkestan, the Uyghur, make Uyghur. So this is their second generation policy. And it was, I'm suggesting, it was very well received by Xi Jinping with his assertiveness, his aggressive policy. So he moved Chen Quanguo from Tibet to East Turkestan. If we all observe the Chinese policy or their hierarchy, we know anyone come to become East Turkestan's number one in party boss, he will be immediately promoted to the Chinese political bureau of the central government, which means it's a promotion for anyone. So Chen Quanguo moved from Tibet to East Turkestan is giving him a hint, you will be promoted. Continue your policy task in Tibet. So immediately after he arrived at Tibet, East Turkestan, Chen Quanguo started expanding his experiment in Tibet, which is concentration camp, police station in 100 meters, and forced marriage. Before that, I have read another one article written by a Chinese scholar in which they compared Tibet with East Turkestan's inter-ethnic marriage, which is actually with the Chinese marriage. And in that article, the author concluded in Tibet, they have 10% Tibetan with Chinese inter-ethnic marriage. But in East Turkestan, it was less than 1%. So we need some policy to switch this resistance to the marrying the Chinese. So Chen Quanguo came, he did that. He has not only expanded the experiment of the concentration camp, jail, and also the inter-ethnic marriage, forcing Uyghur to marry the Chinese. If you marry the Chinese, you will have free housing, free education for your kids, and cash money, and for life, all health insurance, everything. So this is a pattern of the Chinese expansionism. In here, I would like to emphasize another one with Mr. Rinpoche's very good point. China now using same as expansionism in the 49 towards the India. And Uyghur also have more cultural relationship with the India than with the Chinese. This soft approach is now try to make India not standing up firmly for this issue, Tibetan issue, Southern Mongolian Uyghur. The Chinese attempt is, first they want to take over the Taiwan. As soon as the China take over the Taiwan, if America not stand firm against China, if give away the Taiwan, then China will control all Asia. At that time, China will dictate the term with India, not India to negotiate. They will dictate the term, and then they can get whatever they want. That's their plan. They want first hold Taiwan, take back the Taiwan, and kick America out from the Asia, then any country dare to challenge China in Asia, they will easily abuse them, bullying them, and take the whole world. So back to our main theme, we need to come together. Even if we are NGO, we're a little bit weaker than the government, but we are the voice of the people. And the democratic country like India and Japan, Taiwan, as the border of the China and immediate threat under the Chinese, come out firm, support us, give us more resource, which means education, like conference like this, which will empower us to come together, stand firm to counter this and stop this threat. It is a genocide in the East Turkestan. For personally, my three sisters in the concentration camp, my brother was killed by the Chinese mob. And starting in 2016, I don't know if my mother is still alive or she is in jail or in concentration camp. And we are all living in this hell, each of us, all Uyghur. And each time when I heard the testimony of the survivor from the concentration camp, immediately come to my mind is my three sisters and their daughters in the concentration camp. What's going on with them? If they are saved, if they are alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kogbore. I think that is quite an elaborate situation briefing on East Turkestan, what is happening right now. Thank you very much for explaining each and every facet of China's rule and the policies that have been implemented so far. I'm still tempted by asking you a specific question. When the Western countries introduced the criticism on the human rights situation in Urumqi and other areas, over 55 countries sided with China. What is your assessment on this? And what is the way to, especially most Islamic countries have sided with China. So what is the way out? Because if China gets so much support, one can say that this is because of BRI investments, or this is because of, many of the Islamic leaders, they probably have been invited to Urumqi or Xi'an or other places. One can say this, but what is the way out on this front? May I invite Mr. Dolkunisa for a brief introduction and as well as exposition. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to thanks to organize this webinar and inviting me and to speak once again. This is my third attendance within 1 year by Nonviolence Alternative Foundation webinar. Brother Ilshat Esen explained everything very clearly. As he mentioned, this suffering is not new. There is some historical strategic background. Uyghurs have been suffering from systematically abuse at the Chinese Communist parties since occupation 1949. After occupation 1955, Chinese government designed East Turkestan as the autonomic region, remaining Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and the promise it will be respected cultural, economic, political, religious right of the East Turkestan people. And this term, Chinese government also promised respect Uyghurs and right of self-determination as well. but China has never kept its promise. Similar situation we have seen in the Tibet, southern Mongolia, and recently Hong Kong. All Uyghur, Tibet, and Mongol people have never enjoyed its autonomy. Mr. Ilshat already mentioned, and the September 11 attack. Before the September 11, Chinese government never blamed Uyghur activism as a terrorist, just separatism, religious fundamentalism, something not like. But up September 11, Chinese government immediately changed the language and blame Uyghur activism as a terrorist because China government has used international war on terrorists and the pretext of crackdown the Uyghurs because it is very easy for China to label Uyghur as a terrorist because Uyghur happen Muslim. Chinese government has launched an enormous strike hard campaign on the Uyghur, had arrested, detained thousands of peaceful Uyghur activists, and has executed hundreds of dissident and religious figures, accused them as a terrorist up to September 11. Actually, I am also one of the person who was accused of terrorist. 2003, Chinese government officially published one long list, among them 4 Uyghur organizations in exile. One is the Turkestan Islamic Movement, one of the Turkestan Liberation Organization, was one of the World Youth Congress, one of the Turkestan Information Center. And I was the president of the World Youth Congress at that time, and my name is the number 3 of the Chinese terrorist list. But whole my life, I have never seen real gun and real bomb. I have just seen on the Hollywood film. But China put me as a top terrorist and put my name in the Interpol list. I have suffered more than 21 years, but I have never stopped for my right. Finally, 2018, February, more than 2.5 years, my red notes was delayed by the Interpol, but China continued blaming the terrorists and internationally. Psychological pressure and also, and I was detained so many country border because of this. I was detained in South Korea, and I could not enter so many countries. Even India also denied me to enter. 2016, still I cannot enter India. This is unacceptable. Today is very high level official also here should be listening to my voice, you know. So, and this is the Chinese government, and to use all international opportunity immediately. And we are already, Chairman, you already mentioned the Taliban and Chinese relationship as well. Because China is the accused the Taliban because that time after Afghan war, because some of them Uyghur were staying in the Afghanistan that time, and the blame is in the Uyghur terrorists. But today, China supported Taliban. We have very clearly, you know. This is the what kind of balance. World must be more attention with Chinese ambition. Well, and why China doing this all? But just because Ilshat already mentioned in the 2009 July 5th peaceful demonstration about crackdown, and this is a peaceful demonstration by Chinese government. This is the terrorist activism as well. But if there is happening is terrorism in Turkestan, if Chinese Communist Party state-backed terrorism was exist all the time, but we will have nothing, no arm, nothing, just make demonstration or read something or write an article like me. My whole in the weapon is this pen, you know. So my laptop, but China blames the terrorists. And particularly Xi Jinping talks of power 2014. Everything is dramatically changed, and the Chinese government, and in the last 5 years, in particular, we have witnessed a strategy of the Chinese government, says shift from under cultural assimilation and the social regional policy to a genocidal policy. Genocide. And the Chen Qianguo, who was the party secretary in Tibet until 2016, when he was a party secretary in Tibet, he cracked down on the huge on the Tibetan activists. Whole the world is witness more because of his repression policy. More than 160 Tibetan brothers and sisters self-immolated. This is the Chen Qianguo time. After he appointed this party secretary in the Turkestan, then he and the turn whole region is the open air prison. Yeah. So most of the time people asking why and no institution Detroit so quickly says recently. Yes, this is one of significant factors of the China's continued interest in Turkestan has been it is abundance of natural resource. While Turkestan is in the whole area and the 4.6% is habitable area. More than 93% place is uninhabitable area. The second large desert, Taklamakan after Sahara, located in this area, But is the all this and under this desert is a natural resource. More than one-third petroleum reserve and the 2/3 coal reserves of China are in Turkestan. Gold, uranium, copper, and other metals and minerals are also very abundant. And Turkestan is the biggest cotton production region in China. 85% cotton in China. Globally, 22% cotton comes from Turkestan. It is a forced labor, coming from the forced labor today, from slavery. And Turkestan total all natural gas resource reserve exists 30 billion tons. Coal reservation 18 billion tons. This is the main and senior Chinese government continually make pressure and don't abandon and Turkestan. Despite of wealth of Turkestan, more than 90% local Uyghur, Kazakh, and Muslim still alive below the poverty line because economic favors only Chinese people. Natural resources are used to serve only needs of the exploiting Chinese population. It does not benefit Uyghur or Kazakh at all. In 1949, Ilshat already mentioned, and also brother Rinpoche already mentioned this. 1949 in the Chinese population, including military and the family of military in Turkestan, only around 4%. Uyghur is more than 85% population. Rest of them 10% people is the Kazakh, Kyrgyz, some other Turkish-speaking people. But no, official number China say is around 45% Uyghur, 40% is Chinese population. This is the official number, but unofficial we don't know. And the Chinese population from 4% to 42%. This is the official number because China's under in the chairman of this conference, Kandopali is already saying is mentions the minority. He is not minority. Tibet is not minority or not. Uyghur is not minority. The Mongol people was not a minority. But today, and the Mongol people, Southern Mongolian already being minority. Chinese government and the main propose Uyghur being minority. Tibet is being minority in our country. But if you compare the population, all country, all land is not minority. Since we cannot use this term minority. If you compare the population, is all the global, all the nations minorities than China. Even India also minorities than China. So it is the problem. And the Chinese government, another reason why Chinese government continually more aggressively policy towards Turkestan Uyghur, because new secret project, Belt and Road project. This is the main center from this project from Turkestan. From Kashgar to Guardan CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, start from Kashgar to Guarda in the Karachi. This is 3,800 kilometers away. This is more than $65 billion project. So China used this Silk Road, and actually Chinese government is a Belt Road project, is Chinese territorial expanded project. Clearly, Chinese government speeding up territorial expansion. It is neighboring country along the Silk Road. So running border conflict between China and the neighboring country. China today has a neighboring conflict with India and Tajikistan, Central Asia, Kazakhstan, even Russia, and Japan. All the country have a territorial issue today. So today is 21st century. It is not easy just to use the military, the occupied one territory. If you occupy, some years later you have to leave. But China used its economic power and trying to occupy its neighboring country for long. And the Chinese government used this Belt project and for the territorial expanded. We have some we have witnessed very clear example in Central Asia country. China gives a loan to the Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, this country, Tajikistan. This government, all government, very corruption, very corrupted government. Chinese government know very well. This government, this country never paid back the loan to China. So that's why China gives this, saying, oh, no problem. You don't, no worry, don't give it back this loan. You just give you land, you know. This is the game of the Chinese government. We have seen in the 2013, because Tajikistan government got a lot of loan credit from China, couldn't pay back, and more than 1,000 square kilometer land to hand over to China. Same thing was happening in the Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. That's why a couple of years ago, and very angry all the Kazakh population and really big demonstration against the government and Chinese the Indian this Kazakhstan government and stopped it. Yeah, this is Chinese government is and now it is saying it's the economic assistance to the Pakistan. This is CPEC, but actually China used this this CPEC publish and transport also. We know maybe up to 10 years later, maybe 5 years later, Pakistan and we may sorry, but it's that time too late because already 11,000 Chinese military deployed to the Pakistan area, Gilgit. Yes, already, you know. And the big why? Chinese government saying, well, because time to time, because this Chinese government, this CPEC, this project, just benefits some of the high levels Pakistan, and not really benefits Pakistani people. And this is also persecuting Baluchi people as well here, Sindh people, and destroyed all the land, this areas. That's why sometimes Chinese worker, Chinese and employer, Chinese people hostage. No, it's Chinese. We have to protect my employer, my workers. So that's why I have to send. I have to protect my own people, my company, my interest. That's why I have to send some and the military and the security force. This is the strategy of the Chinese government. We are trying to use our experience. Tibetan people, we had a bad experience in the many years. Uyghur have many years. So the Mongolian people had a lot of experience. Now we have seen the clear experience in Hong Kong. So we are using our experience trying to explain this to listen to the other nation around the world. But some country, oh, China is wonderful. China is very economic country. Oh, China is wonderful. So, but up to 10 years, 15 years later, what kind of work we can start? We don't know. No, in Sri Lanka, the other hand, China controlled strategic importance port of the Hambantota, 99 years old, 99 years for the rent is. But it's 99 years. What was happening? Yeah. So, and that's why, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry Wang Yi is saying, and the CPEC is biggest comprehensive bilateral project between two countries, and the Belt Road in the also very and the significant projects of the China. So that's why we are talking from the experience, warning to the whole world, because today CCP Chinese government not only threatened for the Uyghur, Tibet, Hong Kong, and the Taiwan sovereignty. Today, CCP already threat global democracy, peace, stability, and human rights. China already used under testing facial recognition, voice recognition, camera technology in Turkestan, then use and Tibet and Southern Mongolia and Hong Kong and the rest of the world. Even some European countries also import Chinese technology, use Chinese technology to the Persian it is people. So if whole the world continue silence, up to 20 years later, China is being today's second big economic power. If continue silent up to 20 years later, first economic power, we have to double think what kind of world we will be living. This is the really threat for the all human being. So this is, but however, international community has long ignored the Uyghur cause, because it believes Chinese would liberal and the open up and on the right relation. But China is getting stronger and uses economic power and spread its authoritarian, autocratic regime to the world. But however, recently we have seen some positive step for the Uyghur prospect, and United Nations, the country divided two parts. Some countries, like United States, European countries, some Western countries, divided one part, but other authoritarian states support China as another part. This June, 2 months ago, UN 47 during this 47 sanction of the Human Rights Council, 44 countries made a joint statement condemning China towards the Uyghur policy. But China mobilized another 64 countries support China. Among them, more than 16 is a Muslim country. Can you imagine? Today, Pakistan President Imran Khan all the time, if something is happening, he all the time talking about Islamophobia. He wants to show he's a protector of Islam. But what's happening to your neighbors? You know? And repeatedly, BBC, Deutsche Welle, several international media had an interview with him. He said, no, China help us. You know, China help us with a difficult time. So at the beginning, he said, I don't know this case. And after 1 year later, repeatedly asking, he's saying, well, China is help us with the difficult time. Yeah, why anything is happening in Europe? Little bit problem is happening in Europe against Islam, then immediately jumping, he is the leader of the protecting the Islamic value. But today CCP is openly saying Islam is ideological illness. It must be eradicated. China really start against Islam, not Islam. Chinese government is ready. CCP is anti-religious organization, largest terrorist organization around the world. You know, and today, and not only Uyghur Muslim, Tibetan Buddhists. Tibetan Buddhism completely destroyed. Chinese Christian also suffering. Uyghur Muslim is suffering. But and then Imran Khan and Saudi Arabia, Iran, all countries support China. This is the unacceptable situation today. Well, however, some US and some European countries already sanctioned some Chinese high-level official who has direct link for the forced labor or the genocide. Today, 6 national parliament, Canada, Netherlands, Lithuania, Czech, Belgium, and UK parliament recognize this atrocity against Uyghurs as a genocide. And US government also recognizes genocide. European Parliament already passed 4 urgent resolutions on the Uyghur genocide and the crime against humanity. And the World Uyghur Congress, because of the or initiative, established Uyghur Tribunal, because Chinese government, this genocidal policy, crime against humanity, must be held accountability for international law. But unfortunately, International Criminal Court China is not a member, so there is no possibility hold accountable by China, and the International Court for Justice should be approved by the UN Security Council. China is blocked and veto right as this UN Security Council. So it is only the way People's Tribunal. So Jeffrey Knight, very well known US, who is the chief prosecutor of the Milosevic, who set up Uyghur Tribunal. First hearing was happening June this year. Second hearing will be taking place September 10 to 13 of September in London. So we are trying to use all capacity. Chinese Communist parties, genocide and the crime against humanity should be held accountability. But now, as I said, we have seen quite a lot of international media, some country, particularly Western country, democratic country, really being the one voice, but not good enough. And India, it is the largest economic, one of the largest economic around the world, and the biggest democracy around the world. So that's why India also should not be silent for this atrocity. India and some country is just with China, some country against China, some country like India is in middle. If this situation and no should not be shown the position of the middle, and silence meaning support China. Silence meaning is support and the partnership of this genocidal policy. This is the view, and thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much, Mr. Isa, for that down-to-earth reflection of what is happening in Xinjiang. Let us now turn to Mr. Ralph Bunch. He's the General Secretary of the Unrepresented Nations People's Organization, UNPO. Let us listen to him on the role of the UNPO. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. And thank you for the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives for inviting me. This is the first time I've had a chance to speak at one of your events, and it's an important one. So I do appreciate it. The UNPO, we're an international organization established to provide a platform for nations and peoples who do not have a representative government at the UN and to protect their human rights to self-determination. Our members actually include some of the people you've heard today. The membership includes the Central Tibetan Administration, the government of Taiwan, the World Uyghur Congress, the Southern Mongolia Human Rights Center. So as you can imagine from that list, Chinese expansionist moves in Tibet, Southern Mongolia, and East Turkestan are issues of major importance to us. For us, it's not just about what's happening within the PRC and to our members, Taiwan, Tibet, East Turkestan, and Southern Mongolia. We're founded as an organization that was opposed to colonialism in all its forms, seeking a world where colonialism is at an end. And when we began, much of what we worked on was about ending colonialism in the Soviet Union. And we continue to work hard today to end US occupation of its colonial possessions. We've helped the people of Palau achieve independence. We're working with the government of Guam. We continue to work on ending that. We also work, obviously, with many, many other parts of the world that have sort of the traditional understanding of colonialism, which is European empire, and trying to deal with the ends of European empire and the impacts of that. But what's so concerning about China for us is that really at the same time we're seeing that the most visible and obvious new empire being formed, it's the least recognized as a colonial power. We've had a lot of people talking about it today as a colonial power, but it's very misunderstood, I think, internationally. Even when the latest US President Biden, assumed office, he was interviewed about the PRC and the One China policy. And he said in his interview, you need to understand their actions in light of the colonialism that China has suffered. You have to understand that these actions, the repression and genocide in East Turkestan, are just an extension of the fear that arose during the era of European and Japanese empire. And I think we at the UNPO, we completely disagree with that. We believe that is cultural relativism at its very worst form. When we look at the People's Republic of China, the actions of the Chinese Communist Party, while we're sure that the legacy of oppression is very strong, and does have a psychological toll, we don't think we can understand China's actions as that of a victim or of a nation that was ending colonialism, but one of that's acting just like all the other empires that preceded it. And we need to look at it in that way. And I think when you look at it in that way, you can better understand its actions in Tibet, in Southern Mongolia, and East Turkestan, certainly better than justifying it on the basis of some sort of old sort of colonial sense of victimhood and fear. There's a tendency, I think we even heard at the beginning of this, to talk about East Turkestan, Tibet, and Southern Mongolia as if it's China's internal policy, and only an internal policy, and then think about the Belt and Road Initiative as an external policy, and to sort of see these things as separate. But from our perspective, they're not separate. They're one and the same thing. It's all together as evidence of a new form of empire that's rising and that needs to be addressed through the mechanisms that were created to end empire in the first place. And I think we need to all be concerned about the militarization, occupation, and repression of the people of Tibet and southern Mongolia and East Turkestan, whether or not we consider them to be part of China and we're worried about human rights, or whether or not we see Chinese expansionism as our biggest threat because we're concerned about, for example, India's territorial integrity. I think we need to be concerned about those internal policies irrespective. Most of the speakers have already said why. But I think, so I'm going to reiterate some of the things that were said, but I think it's really important that we think about those things internally and externally. I sent around some slides. I'm not sure if they're going to go up. If they go up, you'll see them. If not, you won't see them. They're just 3 pictures of maps, and the maps that you'll pretty much know. One is the map of the Belt and Road Initiatives and its rail and sea port projects. We released a report last year called A Tale of the Three Ports, and it looked at Gwadar rail port, Gwadar seaport, Urumqi's rail port, and the building of a rail port in Duisburg in Germany. And we wanted to look at that to see what happens to the rights of indigenous people and minorities when the Belt and Road Initiative moves forward. We wanted to understand whether or not you could look at Urumqi just on its own and then look at Gwadar separately, or whether you had to see them as one and the same thing. And from our perspective, you have to see them, from the perspective of our research, as one and the same thing. You have to see them as one and the same thing for a couple of reasons. One, because the types of repression that you see happening within East Turkestan, southern Mongolia, and Tibet, those types of repression, maybe not in the gravity of those repression, but in the methodology, they can be seen everywhere that China's influence goes, whether or not it's in China or whether or not it's outside of China. It's irrespective. So if you look at the protests that are happening in Gwadar today, over the weekend, why were those protests happening? Well, they were happening because the indigenous population of Balochistan in Pakistan, of the area around Gwadar, have been systematically excluded from their land, from the port of Gwadar, from job opportunities in Gwadar. They've been excluded from all aspects of their traditional lives and from the development of their area, at the behest of the government of China, so that it has, as somebody else said before, it has a seaport into, I think it was you, so before, it has a seaport into the Indian Ocean. And you can see that happening in the same way. You can also look at Duisburg and see something a bit different, but also no less interesting. You can see when you're looking at the building of Duisburg, most people don't even know what Duisburg is. It is being built to be the largest rail port in the world. It's being built to receive as much as possible of the goods that come from the People's Republic of China into the European Union via East Turkestan and Urumqi. And that is an economic thing, but it's also a political move. By creating and putting so much emphasis towards the Duisburg port and the rail port, they have, the government of China has effectively been able to split the European polity against its own, so that they can't take cohesive action against what they're doing in East Turkestan. There is huge competition within Europe to receive the bulk of the trade from China, whether it's ports in Italy like Venice, or ports in the Netherlands like Rotterdam, or the Duisburg rail port. And those ports and the competition that's gone on along those ports has meant that the European Union and European states are systematically incapable of addressing what's happening in East Turkestan, in Tibet, in southern Mongolia, because their economic interests are tied into the port. And that was just looking at the rail ports. There's another map that I have out there, which is you all know it. It's a map of the Tibetan Plateau and all of the rivers that flow from the Tibetan Plateau. And we've kind of talked about the dams and all of that stuff before. But again, when we were talking about it, it was people talking about the Tibetan Plateau and the dams in Tibet and what that means for the Tibetan people. But the Tibetan Plateau is the the water tower, I guess is what people call it, of Asia. You know, where if you control Tibet, you can control the water of Pakistan, of India, of Southeast Asia. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing. The damming that's happening in the Tibetan plateau and the problems that the Tibetan people have with their own land and their own environment are being repeated to the Sindhi people in Pakistan as they build dams up in Northwest Frontier Province and then Gilgit-Baltistan, which, by the way, should be a complete violation of international law. But as the CPEC comes down and helps build those dams, as the Belt and Road Initiative goes into Laos and builds the 7 dams of the Nam Kyu dams at the beginning, at the top of Laos, and then builds more dams into Cambodia, the indigenous communities along the way, just like the indigenous Tibetan people, are having their livelihoods, their access to land destroyed and taken away from them. There was just a report just last week by Human Rights Watch about what was the dam in Cambodia, the Lower Sisan second dam, that has resulted in the dispossession of many thousands of indigenous populations of their land. And if you go all the way down into Vietnam, into the Delta, just like the Sindh people in Pakistan, you look at the Khmer people in the Mekong Delta, at the bottom there's no water for them left. The delta's disappearing, not as much as the Indus River Delta, but it's disappearing. Their livelihoods are going away. And all of that is part of the same geopolitical game that's being played. It's partly economic, but it's also partly about control, about expanding the empire. And when you see what's happening in those places, you have to see the same thing that's happening to the Tibetan people. Again, maybe not in the severity, because I guess the People's Republic of China don't have the direct ability to do that. But in terms of the method and the reasons for doing it, they're there. It's one and the same thing. And then when you think about the international order, leaving aside Asia and its the attempts to control Asia, it's very clear that the People's Republic of China's actions are designed to reshape the international system, to fundamentally undermine the system that has kept, with a moderate degree of success, peace from 1945 till today. And you can see it in so many different ways. You can see it with the building of ports in Gilgit-Baltistan, of dams in Gilgit-Baltistan. Violations, helping the government of Pakistan violate the UN Security Council resolutions on in India-Pakistan, on Kashmir. You can see it also actually in what's happening in Afghanistan in a different way. In 2007, 2017 and 18, the UN Security Council issued 2 resolutions that talked about regional infrastructure projects being a positive benefit to international peace and security, and they specifically named the Belt and Road Initiative, if they go into Afghanistan and don't exclude Afghanistan from the development of international trade. But what you can see with the Belt and Road Initiative is it's being used as a geopolitical tool to isolate India on one side, to exclude Afghanistan historically, so that the less economic development goes into Afghanistan than could have done. And now I'm sure that with the new supporters that are there in Afghanistan, we're going to see the Belt and Road Initiative finding its way there now, as opposed to when it was actually needed before. And then you can see it at the United Nations. We've got 3 reports that we've issued at the UNPO on a series of reports called the Compromise Space. And the Compromise Space reports chart efforts by the People's Republic of China to target their own people, the indigenous populations of Tibet, southern Mongolia, East Turkestan, as they act at the United Nations, to stop their voices from being heard. Some of the people who've spoken have already been suffered from this. They're victims of this. And we're seeing that happening. And in taking those actions against those people, they're reforming, the People's Republic of China is reforming the whole system of the United Nations to make it less acceptant to indigenous populations, make human rights a lower agenda of the international system, and to promote things like economic development without a human rights basis. So unrestrained economic development, you could call it, I guess. And at the same time, you're looking at a government that has managed to turn, I have a map that I was going to show you that turns 45 of the world to support its genocide of the Uyghur people. But now, according to Dolkin, it's 65 nations. what does that mean for the peace and security of the world when 65 nations think that genocide is okay? And that's what's happening. The system is being reformed. And when the system's being reformed, when UN Security Council resolutions are being flouted by economic development programs, when the fundamental basis of the United Nations that there's equality between peoples, that as one UN General Assembly resolution said in 1952, that the right to self-determination and its violation has resulted in bloodshed and war, and the only way to save, they say in 1952, and I quote, save the present and succeeding generations from the scourge of war, is to uphold human rights and the right to self-determination. When the system is being reformed by the People's Republic of China in every way that it can to undermine those positions, those foundational positions of the international system, all that we have left is the system that we had before the war, one of empire and one of an unstable world. And just to say, Dolkin said, Mr. Issa said, what will the world look like in 10 to 15 years if we don't do something about this? And he said he doesn't know, but I do. It will look a heck of a lot more like the world before 1945 than it does today. And that's a very scary proposition. And I think, unfortunately, we are not rising to the challenge of it. So at the beginning, someone asked, what can India do? And I think the ambassador has some really great suggestions around economic weight and military and military challenging and bolstering the military. I think those are very important, but I think also you don't have to go that far to do something very meaningful against China. In fact, I think you don't have to do that at all. I think what India could do better than anything else is highlight China's status as an imperial nation. Highlight the fact that what China stands for stands against everything that underlay the fight for independence in India. Recognize as clearly as possible the genocide against the Uyghur people. I think India can take heed from the Cold War and recognize also that just promoting its own liberty and democracy are some of the best tools it can have to fighting back against the economic authoritarianism of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think pushing back against everything that's happening at the United Nations would be critical. Making sure the United Nations is still one that's grounded in human rights, still one that's grounded in equality between peoples, and not one that's all about economic development without any sense of rights for the people underneath. I think those are things that can be done without money, without military power, but would have a huge weight. So those are my suggestions anyway. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bunch. On the last point, I'm tempted to intervene. India does promote democracy abroad. Since 2001, while India has been confined to Southern Asia, as we call, including Tibet. But if you recall, Prime Minister Modi made a speech in Japan in September 2014, suggesting that India is taking a big leap in terms of spreading democracy abroad, not just confined to Southern Asia, but also in the international domain. And in fact, the Indian contribution to the UN Democracy Fund substantially increased after that. And of course, we do a significant role in the neighborhood. Well, I think we had a very good, interesting, stimulating discussion so far. I see in the chat box that many wish to raise questions. May I request anyone who wants to pose any question or intervene or make some comments on what has been discussed so far? Please unmute yourself and intervene.
Yes, I just have a quick question to the moderator. You had posed some questions. Are we to answer those later, or?
Yeah, we gathered the questions from everyone, and then I will get back to you all.
Okay.
Before you gather your thoughts, may I invite Mr. Colonna? You mentioned in the chat box about the interactive session.
Well, thank you all very much, and hello to everyone present. I'm Günther Kronia from the European Academy of Bolzano, South Tyrol, shortly called EURAC Research. I'm also active in the Tibet support movement, and so I'm here in a double capacity. Now, I've recently read several publications on British empire building, especially in the hands of the East India Company, and some of the things that were mentioned in the talks by the various Uyghur gentlemen, and about what's happening in East Turkestan, very much reminded me of the history, the expansion of the British in India, and the way they played one Maharaja out against the other, and how they tricked the local population and did their interest, and especially as the military came in and they brought their own regiments to defend British interests, and at the end they just took over the country, and it took you almost a century between 1857 and 1947 to recover your independence. There was very much, this sounded very much of what I read in reading about the history of India. Intended as a warning, of course.
To whom is this directed?
No, this was more an observation. It was not really a question. It reminded me of that, and we can use this as a warning. And of course, from an Indian perspective, you might comment on this, whether my assessment was right or whether it was just superficial.
May I request Ambassador Sibal if he could reply on this, sir? So let us turn to the speakers, distinguished speakers, if they would like to respond to any of the comments mentioned so far. Yes, please go ahead. Mr. Togucho.
Yes, in the chat box, actually, I saw Mr. Kolna's comment mentioning that what China is doing is exactly what the East India Company did in India. But I was responding in the chat box also. I think it's really actually in what China is doing is worse than what the East India Company did. After centuries of colonization, at least India was able to regain their independence, sovereignty, and but from our history of like only 70 years of history of southern Mongolia, East Turkestan, and Tibet, it is really difficult for any of those BRI nations to regain their independence if they or to be colonized by China, because China is as Mr. Burns Ralph mentioned that China is the least recognized colonial power. It's a true colonial power, and then colonization is like mostly put their population right, transfer their population into the destination areas. So China is like, for example, in southern Mongolia, before the 1949, the Mongolian population ratio to Chinese was 5-1. Now we are like the ratio is reversed, 1-5, 1 Mongolians to 5 Chinese in southern Mongolia. Imagine that. If Chinese colonization goes at this speed in those Belt and Road Initiative countries, it is really difficult for those nations to regain their independence, because China is a true, real colonial power.
Thank you for that intervention. May I request the Venerable Rinpoche to intervene?
Yes, earlier I was given 2 questions about Mongolians' unity and about the conference that was held in Japan in the early 20th century. I just want to briefly share my experience. As I mentioned before, my parents immigrated to the United States after the Second World War, and every time an American would ask them, "Where are you from?" or "What is your background?" They never said that I'm from Russia. The reason that they never said that they're from Russia is because if they said I'm from Kalmykia, which our territory is called, people don't know where that is. So it's like, where's Kalmykia? Then they have to be reminded of the constant pain and the suffering and the hardships that they had gone through, the deportation of our people, the struggles, living as refugees across Eastern Europe and finally immigrating, not knowing whether their relatives are alive or not. So instead, they always said, we are Mongolians. It was easier because Mongolia was a nation, everybody knew it, and most of all, everybody knew Chinggis Khan. So to them, instead of reliving that pain, they said, oh, I'm from Mongolia. And everybody said, yeah, Chinggis Khan, he was a, great leader or whatever. So it gave them like inspiration, it elevated their spirit, the spirit of. So I made my first visit to Mongolia, not even knowing all these different distinguishes such as Buryat and Tuva. I only know Kalmykia. But as I said, growing up, listening to our parents that we are Mongolians, I went to Mongolia with the impression that I'm going back to my homeland. When I got to Mongolia, I started to interact with the older generation who knew about the history of the deportation and so on. They said to me right away, "Chi Mongol bishi," in Mongolian. What does that mean? That means you are not a Mongolian. So, as any other nomadic culture, we had this unity, then we fell apart because of all these tribal issues, just like what's happening in, Pakistan, northern parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan as well. The Mongolians, they have the Torguts, they have the Oirats, they have the Khalkhas, and so. The Tibetan have the Khampas, the Amdos, and the Central Tibetans, and I'm sure that exists among many other ethnic groups as well. When I go to Mongolia, I always criticize openly. I always say, let's look at the Chinese flag. There's 5 stars on it. What does it symbolize? They're claiming other ethnicities as being Chinese. The biggest star being the most populated, which is the Han Chinese. The 4 other stars are Uyghurs, Mongols, Tibetans, and the Manchus. They're claiming people, ethnic groups that are not even Chinese. The Mongolians, instead, they say, Chi Mongol Bishi, which means you're not Mongolian.
We lost your voice. We lost your voice.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? 1, 2,
Yes.
3. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's one of the disadvantages that the Mongolian people have, and I'm sure this is not only among Mongolians, but also among many other nomadic groups as well. Even among the Tibetans, we have this division. We have the Amdos, we have the centralized Tibet. I don't think there's space for that in the 21st century. I don't think there's any division for that. We have to come together as not only people who are suffering under a totalitarian rule, but also as human beings. Just like His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, the human nature, the nature of every human being is based on compassion. So we automatically have this compassion-based life. So what is happening, the atrocities that are happening not only under communism, but in any part of the world, we have to put humanity first before thinking about money or thinking about material gain. We have to think about our brothers and sisters who are not able to express themselves spiritually, morally, physically, whatever way. So I think that's of course it's a larger issue, but I think overall I try to be optimistic and try to look at things. Now the second question is in terms of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's visit to Russia. The last visit was in 2004, which I was very involved in that visit. We have to go back and look at and assess how did that visit took place and why it took place. The first visit to, well, I shouldn't say the first visit, but what's interesting is the Dalai Lama was able to visit the Soviet Union, a communist country, more frequently than a democratic country. In 1979, he made the first visit, and followed with a few visits throughout the 80s. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, he has only been able to visit 3 times versus 7 or 8 visits during the Soviet Union. But now, when Putin's government came into power, well, I shouldn't say power because I live in Russia. When he was elected, Putin's government sent his prime minister, Mikhail Kasyanov, to Beijing when they were starting to establish their ties. They sent the prime minister to China, with the expectation that he would return with every agreement signed. There was 30 points. Out of the 30 points, China only signed 15 of those points in the agreement. So that was in August of 2004. Prime Minister came or counterattack. How are we going to aggravate the Chinese? The discussion was done, and the foreign minister said, "Oh, the president of Kalmykia and the spiritual leader of Kalmykia been wanting to invite the Dalai Lama for a long time. So let's allow His Holiness to come, and we'll get what we wish for." That's exactly. The Dalai Lama came August, September, October, 3 months later, and it was a very short visit. But nevertheless, after that visit, Russia got what they wished for. Not only that, they got even more than what the original agreement is for. So to this day, it's an issue. Every year, we apply to the foreign ministry. We write to the president's administration, as well as the prime minister's administration, and so on. And every year, it's the same excuse. We're monitoring it. We're assessing the situation. Oh, this year is a year of culture of Russia in China. The next year, the year of China's culture in Russia. The Olympics are coming up. You know, oh, the prime minister is getting ready to come to Russia, or the prime minister is getting ready to go to China. Every year, it's the same excuse, on and on. Interestingly, I should mention here, I forget the month, but it was in spring. The prime minister of Russia visited Kalmykia. In the original schedule program, he was not scheduled to visit the Buddhist temple. I was in Moscow at that time. I asked around, is the prime minister coming to the temple or not? Everybody said no, it's been excluded. We proposed, not going to happen. Okay, so I said, okay, in that case, there's no need for me to go to Kalmykia. So I stayed behind. Surprisingly, throughout mid of his program, in the middle of his program, spontaneously decided that he would go to to visit the temple. So my staff was there, and out of all, on such situations, you know, we assess the situation and we discuss whether it's feasible to bring up the issue of the Dalai Lama's visit or not. So we decided, okay, let's keep quiet for now because the time hasn't come. He's just been appointed as the prime minister. Let's leave it for now. Surprisingly, the prime minister himself asked, why is the Dalai Lama not able to visit Russia? I mean, he's asking us. I mean, that's a question we should be asking him. He's asking us to get a judgment of how we react. So of course we mentioned, you know, of course we're waiting for His Holiness's visit and so on and so on. And at that time he said, oh, in March, yes, I remember now. He said, in March, I'm planning to go to China and I will bring up this issue. He voluntarily said this. Now that's something very rare that happens. That sends a very strong political message to us as followers. I don't think he simply said that just to be sympathetic or be compassionate, but there was a reason that Russia wanted to discuss this particular issue with the People's Republic of China. That means something is going on. As I was mentioning before, if we look at the global situation right now, every country needs allies. Against Iran, the issue of Iran, Russia and China together. Let's look at the United Nations and the Security Council. Every time Russia and China, they're together. Let's look at the issue of Syria, Russia and China, they're together. So in terms of East Turkestan, in terms of Southern Mongolia, in terms of Tibet, Russia can't even decide whose side to be on. Frankly, they cannot do that. Because if they take the sides of China, they very well know that they have 3 traditional Buddhist republics who have historical ties with Tibet, with Mongolia, and with India as well, which are Buryat, Kalmyk, and Tuva. And nowadays, we have a fourth region, which is called Zaibaigalsky Krai, you know, which was previously known as part of Republic of Buryatia, but it kind of divided. So if they take the sides of the China by not allowing the Dalai Lama to come, then they don't get our votes. If they allow the Dalai Lama to come, then China says, okay, we don't want to buy gas and oil from you anymore. I mean, which most likely won't happen, but of course there would be many other, damages, economically. So right now, because of the world's global situation, Russia needs allies, China needs allies, and they're the strongest ally right now. Economically, materially, Russia and China, I think, my personal point of view, Russia is much more powerful. Economically, China is much more powerful between these two countries. So they need to unite that to go against the West, against Europe, against America. And exactly that's how it is right now. Anti-America, anti-America, anti-America. China is in that case, and Russia is in that case. I myself, I can't even get a simple vaccination.
We lost your voice again.
Vaccine. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I was just talking about vaccine, you know, in terms of vaccination. I can't get vaccinated, and beginning of this month, I was infected by COVID, and to this day I still had COVID, but I'm in isolation. The reason I couldn't get vaccinated is because it's politicized. Nobody cares about health. Nobody cares about the well-being of human beings. Get vaccination and so on. Why? If I got Sputnik V vaccination, I went to the West, they won't recognize that. It's not recognized. I can't visit certain governmental buildings even if I'm vaccinated. Why? Because it's made by Russia. Here in Russia, if I'm vaccinated by Pfizer, Moderna, or whatever it is, I can't visit certain institutes. For example, Moscow State University. It's over that says that you cannot enter the premises unless you are vaccinated. Sputnik V is accepted. Besides, you know, the way so like vaccination, you know, it's all like politicized, you know. And just look at you know, India and China. What did China say? Unless you get the Chinese vaccine, you cannot visit China. I mean, that's a disgrace to India. Come on. That's a disgrace. And, you know, again, they know very well that China is full of opportunities, more perspective than China. It's just all about taking action. Sorry if I went too long. Yeah, just wanted to answer these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Mr. Ilshad.
Yes, thank you. First answer the question you pointed on me. Yes, in last year and this year too, when the United Nations initiated by Europe condemning the Chinese atrocity against the Uyghur, and majority of the small country, third world country, mostly stand by the Chinese side. And especially the astonishing is the Muslim majority country. They are all supported China, and China is the most aggressively insulting Islam belief and country, I would say. They ban the Quran, they demolish the mosque, they're banning people to go into the mosque, and now they are producing their own version of the Quran, which is called the New Translation. And they are twisting its meaning and to make it comply with the Chinese characteristic. So they are creating a Chinese version of Islam. But no Imran Khan, no Erdogan, no anyone stand up, say something. This is irony, and it's a loss of their dignity. And it's also disappointed us, of course. But same time, we'll continue to mobilize the people of this Muslim majority country, because, as I said before, most of the Muslim majority country, from my perspective, they are still not modernized country. Their ruling elite is corrupted. They are not inclusive, and that's why they are easily be bought by the Chinese government. Even the Taliban, they're claiming they are back to the Islam's fundamentalism, but they also can cooperate with China. And 20 years ago, they sent back some Uyghurs from Afghanistan when they were on the rule. And now they're promising it again. Even though in the Chinese Communist Party's constitution, it's written, eventually they will get rid of all the religion. It's include Islam. And for Taliban, they believe they are the only the truth holder. Anyone against them, they want to save them by force, by violence. But still they can come together because of their money. And the Chinese, we discussed a lot about the Chinese economic approach. On the back is a political approach. They give money without any condition. Just take the money, we talk later how to pay it back. So a lot of this corrupted leadership, they like it because no any condition, they don't need to give back where they spent the money. So that's the advantage the Chinese taking. And that's why the Muslim majority country is standing by the Chinese side. And another one is Chinese anti-imperialism claim. And the Muslim majority country try to depend on the China to balance their power shift. That's the reason. And also in using this opportunity, I want to make another one comparison for the history. Ms. Colleague compared it to the East India Company in India from the British colonization. I would say it's too far comparison. We need to compare it to before the Second World War, when Hitler come to the political power in Germany, and he claiming the German people was victimized by after the First World War, and the leading democratic country, British and the France, try to appease them. They feel some leader of them feel their guiltiness towards the German people. So they give away, and America is isolated. They don't want to interfere with Europe. And also the bordering country, Poland and Czechs, they also looking at the British and France. When they saw their appeasement, they also give away, which encouraged Hitler to become more aggressive. And no need to tell all experts the end of that story. We know we had a human disaster. We paid very big for that. And now the China is same as specifically Xi Jinping is another copy of the Hitler. They are claiming the Chinese people had suffered under the imperialism. They are the victim. And the US is hesitating. And Europe is hesitating. They want to appease them. And India and Japan and other East Asia country was looking at US and Europe saying, oh, we are not strong enough to stand up. Possibly we can negotiate. We can get some coexistence. No. This history we should learn. You can't appease a dictator, a Nazi-style leader. They're never satisfied with border. They will go again and again until they dictate all the term, or we have to fight back, pay more for later. And if we can't stop the China, even if US not challenging the China will challenge the US. And when last week, President Biden, in his answer to the journalists, say, we can't send a soldier to everywhere where the women's, the kids' rights was abused. In the China, Uyghurs was in the concentration camp. How? Can I send our U.S. soldiers to there? No, Biden said. So a lot of Uyghur was very upset for that comment and say, oh, the U.S. president said we wouldn't send the soldier, we wouldn't help. We are just using the human rights. And some of the Uyghur ask me, is that the conclusion? I say no. Even though President Biden don't want to fight with China, but China eventually will bring U.S. to the war if we are not stopping them now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I invite Ambassador Sibal to say something about the intervention so far? Especially Mr. Ralph Bunch has mentioned about India's options. What's the options?
You know, we are living in a, you can hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes. Yes, sir, please go ahead.
We are living in a world, in the real world, where we have to see what the balance of forces is and what kind of alliances or ententes or groups that are being built in order to each, in its own perspective, contribute to peace and stability, the usual cliches we use in international relations. The fact is that China's rise could not have occurred without the United States and its allies. And I had in my earlier remarks outlined what the narrative was. And that narrative was very self-serving and has proved to be false. Now, having built China to that level, the West is finding it very difficult to confront China. So they are developing all kinds of formulae, cooperate and confront and compete and all that. But these are just cover. This is a cover for adjusting their policies in a way that subserves their interests without entering into a confrontation. U.S. is continually saying that they don't want a conflict with China. They're trying to engage China. Now we hear that the U.S. Treasury Secretary will be going to China. President Biden himself says that they'll focus on human rights issues, climate change issues, energy issues, because these are areas in which they need the cooperation of China, whereas they will compete very vigorously with China, whatever that means. They have done nothing in the South China Sea. They have not taken any position on sovereignty issues. They have not sanctioned Pakistan, which has been the real source of their debacle in Afghanistan. They have not taken any. They did not take a position on the CPEC for many years. And even now, it is India that has taken the lead. And the language we developed in order to challenge the basis on which the BRI was being implemented is the language now that the United States and other countries have begun to use. But this is only a criticism of the BRI, but efforts to offer an alternative, whether it is a blue network or whatever it is called, or
Blue Dot Network.
A Blue Dot Network, or Japan's Finger Enhanced Quality Network, or whatever, infrastructure, or whatever, all these formulas that are being used. But the point is, where is the money behind it? And how much money can be put into this? And how easy or difficult it is to have trilateral, multilateral, plurilateral cooperation between countries when their objectives and priorities are different, to finance the very expensive infrastructure, which the Chinese can do because it's a single country national enterprise. Is the CCP that is taking all the decisions. They don't have to consult anybody. It's not based on economic parameters where the profit and loss issues have also to be looked at very carefully and stuff like that. Now, I'm giving you a long-winded background to say that leave the moral issue aside in the purely practical terms. To put the burden on India to stand up to China on many of the issues which are of concern to the international community in general. Because beyond that, it's a question of international peace and stability. It's not simply a question of a conflict between India and China. It's a much larger question. So therefore, to expect that India should take up the Uyghur issue when the West has imposed some very mild sanctions. I mean, sanctioning a few individuals who are responsible for these policies is neither here nor there. And at the same time, if you look at figures of bilateral trade between US and China, that is continuing as before. The European Union has become the biggest partner of China. In fact, EU-China trade is today bigger than the EU-United States trade. So these are the realities on the ground. We have many issues with China. We have the bilateral issue, bilateral territorial issue, their claims on our territory, their relationship with Pakistan, using Pakistan as a strategic weapon against us, undermining our positions in Nepal, trying to do it in Bhutan, in Sri Lanka. They have succeeded. In Maldives, they have succeeded, but they received a setback. In Bangladesh, they continue to try hard. Myanmar, they had a setback, but they are coming back. In Afghanistan, they're going to establish themselves more strongly than before. So we have so many issues and challenges with China. My own feeling is that we have to begin somehow with Tibet and the Dalai Lama, the succession issue, and Taiwan. These are the issues on which we should concentrate and move away from our existing policies. And after having created room for ourselves, then see where we can try and raise some other issues which are of concern to us. We have also to take into account, and the last point I want to make, is that we have to be careful about how we handle the the Russia-China relationship. We have the Russia-India-China dialogue, we have BRICS, we are members of the SCO. So are we then going to take, as it is on the Indo-Pacific and Quad, we have now serious conceptual differences with Russia. Are we then now going to take up issues vis-a-vis China, which will make the whole triangular cooperation, SCO cooperation, BRICS cooperation, that much more difficult to handle? Will our foreign policy suffer on that account, or will it not suffer on that account? Will the balance of our foreign policy be disturbed or not disturbed? These are the issues we have to take into account. In other words, we must hasten slowly. We should know what our target is. We should adjust it to the kind of challenges that we continue to face from China, but keep the channels of dialogue open with China, as everybody else is doing. All the countries which are seeking confrontation with China are actually engaging China and keeping the doors of dialogue open. We have to do that also. So I'm giving you a practical view of how, what the compulsions are and how we are going to handle those. And finally, with regard to the East India Company question, see, that was a different era, different time. It was a private company. The Chinese are not using private companies to take over other people's countries and lands, as happened during that colonial era. But more important than that, China is today an economic power, but is not a military power that can extend its sway far beyond its shores. Unlike the United States, which has allies or military relationship with 70 countries, with 700 bases of various kinds in various countries and territories. China has only one base in Djibouti and potentially another one in Pakistan. their navy is still very weak. So their capacity to project power and protect their interests is very limited. Number two, we have seen in the past also US unilateralism, using the tools of in the international financial institutions, political institutions to exert their influence and power worldwide, hasn't succeeded. Now the African countries which individually can be exploited, there is the OAU, which has a certain force of its own. So it's not very easy for China to actually take over countries. Yes, they can have a great deal of influence on countries. They can have pieces of land in which they implant themselves. But it's not easy at all in today's world to actually compromise genuinely the independence and sovereignty of other countries, because the whole international system, however faulty it is, gives the chance to these countries to resist, as they have been resisting in the past. So I'm not too perturbed about the PRI becoming kind of a new East India company and compromising the sovereignty and independence of countries. And finally, let me conclude with that. The thing is that many of these developing countries have had, from their perspective, a very negative influence, a negative experience of Western power. Not now, not after only the Second World War, but over a few centuries in terms of colonialism and exploitation and this and that. So there is a mental resistance to once again coming under the wings of the United States and confronting China. So they're not unhappy that China has developed into a force which can be a countervailing force to the West, and which broadens their margin of maneuver and enables them to get benefits from both sides. It's a new form of non-alignment, but this time it's not Russia, it is China. So that is the dynamics behind this also, but there is a feeling of independence and sovereignty. Even countries like Cambodia have begun to feel very uneasy under Chinese domination. So let's see how the whole thing goes. India will progressively find means and ways to confront China, and some of the friends that we have here will find that beginning with the kind of conversation we had today, we will begin to have more and more understandings and mutual support on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for contextualizing the Indian policies, the realistic assessment. I see Mr. Bunch had raised his hand. Would you like to intervene?
Yes, if you can hear me. Yeah, I want to challenge whether or not that is a fully realistic assessment, with respect. There's some serious contradictions, I think, in what was just said, that I think need to be highlighted. And one is that I think my position was not to place all of the burden on India. I was certainly not trying to do that on dealing with China. But on the other hand, and I think that was very realistic to say that you can't deal with China on your own, and I completely agree with that. But at the same time, I think you also very realistically said that there's a reticence amongst what are now becoming China client states to come under the influence of the West once again. And I completely agree once again with that. But I think where the lack of reality then comes out of it is that you can't then draw a conclusion that India should just sort of play its own game. In this circumstance, where the international community is moving away from Western dominance, where you have a great democracy that has been able to push its own influence internationally through the liberal democratic process, I think there is a responsibility for the people of India, the government of India, to take a lead and make the West follow, albeit that the West has more money and that they'll do things. But until they hear from a great power, from a post-colonial country, saying that you're dealing with a new colonial system, and the only way to deal with it is to rally together and join together. Until they have the leadership from somebody in Asia, on this issue, you're still going to end up with this realpolitik rubbish that doesn't solve anything, that China's going to divide and rule everybody. So while I'm not saying that the government of India should stand on its own against China, of course not. I mean, that's impossible. By the way, I very much disagree about the military capabilities. I think the Taliban have proven that you don't have to have big military capabilities to win a war very fast these days, even these days. And I mean, we talked a lot about Nazi Germany. People thought it was absolutely unbelievable that they could have taken Europe at the time that they did. Their military capabilities were very small comparatively. They just moved fast. And I think the same thing is, could be true here. So anyway, I think it is an urgent threat. I think there's an urgent military threat. I think you're looking at a country in India that is the greatest, is a great democracy. I spent a very, significant parts of my life living in Delhi, working with an organization that helped push out Indian values through Kailash Satyarthi's Global March Against Child Labor. And I think leadership from the Global South, as people call it, leadership from India on this issue can work, miracles in terms of moving the West towards doing something, because the West is all caught up in this whole, is this colonialism, is not colonialism, and all the client states are worried about the West. So we need India. And it's things like seeing Chabahar Port in Iran moving away from Indian influence and towards Chinese influence that's really very concerning. And while there's money that has to go behind it and all of those other things, I think that's what we need to see more of. So anyway, I'm not saying that India should stand alone. I am, however, saying that India should recognize its role and responsibility in the world today as the leading liberal democracy from a post-colonial country, and the influence that can have on the client states of China. Forget about Pakistan. Think about the other ones in Southeast Asia. This is critical, and I think what I'm suggesting there is that a more vocal India would be very important. One that would recognize and call out imperialism when they see it would be extremely important, even if that isn't, realpolitik and building of militaries and playing the economic game, but at least trying to take some leadership of the liberal world away from the West. And I think the West would welcome it, and I think it could have a huge influence, and it could very well save India in the future. As I see the map, India is getting increasingly isolated in Asia, and that I think should be a call for alarm, and one that requires more global leadership. And part of that more global leadership is also pushing back at the United Nations on reforms that go against the foundational principles of the United Nations. You said very well, Ambassador, that these client states have at least recourse to the structures of the international system, but those structures are being undermined by China, and they will be gone, and they will no longer have recourse in the near future if someone doesn't stand up and push back. And unfortunately, even governments such as yourselves, as the government of India, have had a history of getting on board with restricting the voices of unrepresented people or minorities and indigenous communities in the United Nations, which only helps the government of China press its repressive agenda. So it's things like that I think that are necessary, and I don't think they're big issues. I think they're ones that could be done realistically in a way that would bring the world towards India and not away from India. Thank you.
May I reply to some of this?
Yes.
Please
go ahead, sir.
A few things. One is that when I was speaking in general terms about how the developing countries or the so-called third world countries still have memories and reservations about how they were treated by the West, and therefore quite happy to have a countervailing power, etc., etc. I was not speaking about India, because there has been a great change in India's thinking. In fact, today, India has drawn much closer to the West than it has ever been. We have signed all the foundational agreements with the defense agreements with the United States. The United States has become a major defense partner of India. We are doing very elaborate military exercises with the United States, and now Japan and Australia has been included. Interestingly, the latest Quad exercises or the Malabar exercises are taking place in the Western Pacific. which sends a particular political message to China. We have bilaterally developed very close relationship with Japan. We are very active in trying to develop east-west connectivity in order to balance China's north-south connectivity. We've tried to woo Myanmar. We have tried to keep our channels of dialogue with Myanmar open and have cautioned the West against pushing Myanmar more and more into the Chinese camp. We did the same thing with Iran without success, and we paid a big price in terms of our relationship with Iran. Part of the damage, part of the consequences of that was the inability to actually implement the Chabahar project in the ways that we would have if these sanctions had not been imposed on Iran, with the secondary sanctions threatened on countries which were collaborating with Iran. With the GCC countries, there's been a very major change in our ties, which just goes to show that we are very willing to get over historical feelings and ideologies to have very close relationship with countries which have heretofore been seen as the cradle of Wahhabism and Islamic fundamentalism and everything else. We are having defense dialogues with these countries. Our chief of army staff has visited Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We have access to naval bases in Oman. We've had the first naval exercise with the UAE. Our Prime Minister had just said a few days ago that we are a net security provider in the Indian Ocean. This is a vast change in terms of India assuming responsibility and in trying to give a lead of sorts in terms of building a kind of a coalition against China's overvaulting ambitions and trying to contain them. So I could give so many other examples, our whole Indian Ocean policy, how we are trying to strengthen the networks in the Indian Ocean, the initiatives that we have taken, our relations with Singapore, our developing ties with Indonesia, with Vietnam, our opening to the Philippines. All this is part of, in a sense, partaking a kind of a leadership role to contain China. On the BRI, just to repeat what I said, we were the first country and the only country which continues to oppose the BRI. We've not made any compromise. We didn't attend any of the BRI forums which China has organized, to which Japan has been going, United States has been going, and Europeans have been going. And finally, we have to be a little careful because there's always this concern that we might actually be blindsided by both the United States and Europe because their relationship with China is so deep, so vast, that they simply cannot jeopardize that. And since physically they're far away from China and there are no territorial and sovereignty issues involving them in China, they can have an approach to China which cannot be the same approach as ours, because we have actually contiguity and we have a direct physical military challenge on land from China on which we know the West will not come to our help. In fact, if you look at what has happened in Afghanistan, the United States has left us completely in the lurch in Afghanistan. Pakistan has been wanting strategic depth in Afghanistan openly and brazenly since long. The United States actually has helped them to get their strategic depth by running away from Afghanistan the way they have. It is their compulsion, it is their decision, but the collateral damage to India is quite serious in this regard. Similarly, with regard to relationship with Iran, they have pushed Iran into the Chinese arms more and more with this agreement that has been signed between China and Iran, which again creates a problem for us. So we have to be a bit careful in how we not allow ourselves to be put in a situation where we take the lead thinking that the West is with us, and then halfway through we find that the West is not with us because their priorities and their interests, which match ours, which are similar as ours up to a point, but beyond that point are not the same. So we have to buy time. We have to build ourselves economically. We have to become militarily stronger. Then maybe we'll be in a position to be a little more forthright and a little more assertive in terms. And finally, on the democracy issue, as was mentioned by Srikant also, we are open to this idea of G10, which Britain had launched, the Summit of Democracies, which United States Biden wants to hold. We'll be very much part of that. Our only difference is that we're not in favor of crusades for democracy, but we made it very clear as to where we stand on the issue of democracy. And our Prime Minister, in various ways, without naming China, has been distinguishing between democracy and authoritarian regimes. And in every speech of his, he highlights the common ground we have with the West, the common commitment that we have, even in his latest speech on democracy. So we're very clear where we stand on democracy. And I think emphasizing that is becoming more and more important in view of the fact that China is projecting itself now as an alternative political and economic model, which is obviously, to my mind, unacceptable.
Thank you, sir. I think all good things should come to an end. Let me hand over to Commodore Vasan, the co-organizer of wonderful.
Thank you, Professor Kondapalli. I think it's been a fascinating session, and a special thanks to Ambassador, Sybil for not only the opening remarks but for clarifying various issues that came up during the discussion. And it clearly tells us where we stand, as far as India is concerned, in terms of our capability, capacity, and potential. And there's a lot that we still need to do. And Ambassador has made it very clear as to what our stance is and how we plan to approach some issues. It's not my intention to sum up everything that's been said by various resource persons here today, because it's been wonderful. But I'll just flag a few issues so that we all are on the same page in terms of how to take this conversation forward. What came out clearly is that China is expanding over land in South China Sea, in East China Sea, and it's incentivizing regimes and others to see that everybody falls into their lap. So what we see today is through the BRI, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, by use of its deep pockets, is able to invest and buy out countries from Asia to Africa and Europe. That is a serious issue, and nobody else is able to match it. And as came out during the discussion, whether it is the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor or the Blue Dot Net, there are limitations because we are trying to compete with an economy which has put aside nearly $4 trillion for such investments across oceans. So that's a factor that needs to be borne in mind. As far as Tibet is concerned, what came out clearly is that there has been environmental degradation, there is subjugation, and it is, after all, the water resource of the world. And yet, we have not been able to contain the kind of hydrodynamics and others which are going on in that area. And Dalai Lama, everyone has said that's perhaps something that we need to work out. So people are not united. It's only recently that even in India that we started making peace with the situation in Dharamshala, and messages have gone across. But everybody keeps asking this question as to when will India use the Tibet card? And what is this Tibet card that we are talking about? So we need to understand that it was Tibet that was a buffer state. And by keeping silent, we allowed China to take over Tibet. Likewise, it's also consumed the southern Mongolia as well as Xinjiang, which is the East Turkestan. And so this is something that it will not give up without use of force. So what are the other measures that are available to the international community for putting pressure on China? The international institutions have failed. In the United Nations Security Council, it has a veto power. So how do you beat a nation that has a veto power? Particularly when it works with Russia. So whatever you bring to the table is something that is sure to meet its death on the table. So it was also brought out that something like $29 billion has been pumped into Tibet for bringing out connectivity. Another point that did not come out is that increased use of technology by which it's keeping its citizens under surveillance, whether it's in Tibet or in southern Mongolia or in Xinjiang. Because this is a tool that is being used extensively to prevent any kind of protest that may come out against the regime. So just about 3 or 4 months ago, in the Chennai Center for China Studies, we had a professor, Robert Dexter, who came and spoke to us. And after 10 years of study, it has been conclusively proved that Tibet, at best, is an illegally occupied territory. So there are different ways in which to deal with such a situation by using the international laws. But who will bell the cat is the question that we need to look at. As far as Southern Mongolia is concerned, when he mentioned 2 million square kilometers, that is the exclusive economic zone of India. That is the kind of territory that China is in possession of. So obviously, whether it's Afghanistan or whether it is Tibet or whether it is Southern Mongolia or Xinjiang, it's about use of resources which are there. The reason why it's in Afghanistan is for using the rare earths or also the copper mines. So, there is a plan and there's a method in the madness which you seem to think that China uses. But we are very clear that it's working to an agenda. A nation that can bring out 11 defense white papers, can bring out a white paper on Tibet, can tell the world that its core interests are South China Sea, Tibet and Xinjiang, will obviously work to this plan to see that there is least resistance. An important point that came out was about the use of Buddhism, the centrality of Buddhism to India. So this is something which we do talk about soft power, but soft power has its own limitations. But it cannot put away the fact that the Buddhist nations of the world can come together and work towards putting pressure through the NGOs and through the local governments, as was suggested. And also, when it came to discussions on the economy, what came out clearly is the standard term it's a cliche term, which says it's economy stupid. So if you have that kind of money, and if you are investing it along the BRI, 62 billions in the China POK economic corridor, which is what I call it in my think tank. We don't call it the China-Pakistan economic corridor because it legitimizes the China-Pakistan corridor. Therefore, we make it a point to call it the China POK economic corridor, Pakistan economic corridor. The point is, if you have invested that kind of a money, you would quite be willing to go to war, right, to defend what you have done. Whether it is the international statutes that tell you that you cannot have these kind of investments in disputed territories. We are aware what it did in Vietnam, and there was oil exploration. And they said you cannot carry out any even scientific exploration in disputed areas. So they are champions of the double standards, which is what is very evident wherever they have gone. So we need to work through different systems of the world, whether it's the NGOs or like our friend here, Ralph, had some very wonderful ideas about how some of the leads can be taken by not just India but other countries. But this requires concerted, unified action, which unfortunately today is not visible because everybody has an interest in dealing with China, though it is unethical. You look at the Muslim nations, for example. There's not one Muslim nation which has said anything against the treatment of the minorities in East Turkestan. In fact, on the contrary, they have endorsed the actions of China. You saw what the Pakistani Prime Minister said and what their president said. So it's very clear that money has been used to buy politicians, to invest where it's required, and particularly the developing nations have a requirement for this money in terms of foreign direct investments. Sri Lanka is an example. Sri Lanka, you see the amount of money that's been pumped into a small country, which is half the size of Tamil Nadu, where I come from. And so over here, this is the stark reality of what money can do. In Sri Lanka, they've gone to the extent of giving away their entire port for 3 generations, 99 years, Hambantota, which has given them a footprint in Indian Ocean region. So it is working to a plan. There is a strategic sense of purpose. And how can we tackle this is the challenge. And I think all the speakers have clearly said what the challenges are. It's not that we do not know what the challenges are, but how are we going to bring the rest of the world on board to be able to take on this big aggressive neighbor of India? How do you take them on? So of course the suggestion that's been given is in terms of India, as the ambassador brought out, to build up our maritime prowess, have a comprehensive maritime national park, ensure that at least in the maritime domain you are able to challenge the Chinese might as they foray into Indian Ocean region, try and get all the nations to pull together, use these forums to bring about greater awareness. At some time, I think the ethical dimensions will start, being felt by people around the world. It's not forever that money can, be used for the other comparison that was brought out about the East India Company is valid to a certain extent, because after all, they use money to come in, set up their business empire, and then took over the entire subcontinent. There is a lesson there. And as was exchanged in the chat box, if you do not learn by history, you are condemned to repeat it. So obviously, we know that it is flag that follows trade, and so therefore, the moves have to be very carefully followed. So what can we do? So one is to strengthen the organizations of the like-minded. Let's start with democracies, because there is a certain values which are attached to how the democracies function. The liberal democracies have a role. What the other smaller nations cannot do, we should be able to do it. But it requires looking beyond money and engagements. We are looking at decoupling from China. China used these 3 decades or 4 decades to establish that kind of a interdependence with all the countries that it's becoming very difficult to decouple today. So perhaps some of the steps include to diversification. The Quad has a role. We are looking at the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative, which is also part of the decoupling that is to take place. It's not that China is not under pressure. Let's not presume that he's got all the friends and they're not under pressure. China is facing the heat both domestically and internationally because it's aggressive behavior. And in my opinion, I think this is the time to strike by the coalition of the willing. And unless you are able to do this now, you would have let China off the hook. That is the danger that we have. So let's not allow China to claim its position as the Middle Kingdom, which it claims to be the inheritor of, and Xi as the emperor. And therefore, unless we are able to bring about greater awareness and also synergize, while we know that all the 3 agencies who are here, all the 3 nations who are affected, they also need to include Hong Kong, which is a point that was made here to say that why are we excluding Hong Kong when we talk about human rights and liberties? Likewise, when you're talking about Hong Kong, why are we not talking about Tibet and Xinjiang? So I think, we have to really work to a plan that corners China and also benefits the people who are here. It's pointless keep on talking about this without having a plan to which you can work. We should have both the short-term measures as well as the long-term measures. So I must personally thank the organizers for bringing these excellent speakers together. Many of them are affected firsthand, and many of them are on the forefront of taking this battle to the next level. So it was very appropriate that we had Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, who came here, not only during the opening remarks, but also in his responses subsequently. He's made it very clear as to where we stand and what are the limitations that are there on the global community and how some of the concerted action can overcome these hesitations from amongst the nations who are in a position to take the lead. So they only will have to blame themselves to provide an opportunity to the people who are affected, whether it is through the human rights campaign, whether it is supporting the campaign for restoring the status of Tibet, Dalai Lama, and others. Thank you very much again for this wonderful opportunity, and we'll keep this dialogue going through the partners of this, which is the FNVA, the ICSB, the Chennai Center for China Studies, the PII, and the Raja Raksha University. Thank you. Jai Hind.